So we're really excited. You can all join us. Welcome. This is School Psychologists as Change Agents. Today's session will feature Dr. Nicole Holland-Sims from our patent team and Dr. Jason Peterson from Derry Township School District. And this session will focus on disciplinary equity and how school psychologists can serve in the role of change agents to promote disciplinary equity back at their schools. This is part one of a three-part series. We hope you're able to join us for upcoming sessions in this series. So again, this is part one, School Psychologists as Change Agents with a focus on disciplinary equity. Next week on April 14th, the second part in the series will have an emphasis on decision-making and multi-tiered systems of support with a focus on literacy data that will feature from our team, Dr. Gina Spignall-Cook, who is with us today as one of our facilitators, Dr. Jen Collins and Mrs. Karen Brady. And then the final session in the series is enhancing our decision-making and multi-tiered systems of support with an emphasis on mathematics data. And that will feature Mr. Jared Campbell, our statewide lead, Dr. Drew Hunter, who's with us today as one of our facilitators, and myself. So you can attend one, two, or all three of the sessions. Please know the sessions are being recorded. We're going to post a link to a Padlet here shortly in the chat where you'll be able to access handouts for today, as well as the upcoming sessions. And then in the future, we hope to have the recordings up there for you. So just a few quick announcements before we get started. Our session is 8:30 to 11:45 today. We will take a 15-minute formal break that will be scheduled in by our presenters about midway through. So know that you will get, a 15-minute break. Please know you must be logged on the entire time to receive credit and logged on to a device such as a computer or an iPad. You can't get credit if you call in via phone. There will be a code that I will provide at the very end of the session, and there is a survey link which you would have received when you registered, as well as your reminder email for this session. I'll post it in the chat again as we get to the very end of the session. And we did develop these sessions so that you could attend 1, 2, or 3, dependent upon your schedule. Each session has its own independent Act 48. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our presenters. Our chat managers this morning are from our school psych team. I'm Erica Caruter. With me is Dr. Drew Hunter, Dr. Gina Spignall-Cook, and soon to be Dr. Shonda Talene. So we'll be managing the chat. I'm going to turn it over to our presenters, Dr. Nicole Holland-Sims and Dr. Jason Peterson.
Thank you, Dr. Caruter. It is an honor and a privilege to be able to present this morning with my friend and colleague, Dr. Jason Peterson. I briefly want to do an introduction of myself and then ask Dr. Peterson to introduce himself as well, and then we'll jump into the content. So my name is Nicole Holland-Sims. I'm an educational consultant at the Patton Harrisburg office. I also serve as the co-statewide lead for the Behavior Initiative. I'm a member of the school psychology team, school psychologist by training, and also on special assignment to the Department of Education around equity. And so this topic couldn't be more relevant than ever. And so we're really ecstatic to have this opportunity to talk to all of you. Dr. Peterson.
Hi, good morning. Thank you, Dr. Holland-Sims. It's weird. I just want to say Nicole, but I'll be formal. No, thank you. It's a pleasure to present to all of you today. As Nicole said, I am Jason Peterson, a school psychologist at Derry Township School District, but I have also the NASP delegate representative for the Northeast. So I'm on the NASP board of directors. I was previously the Pennsylvania delegate for 6 years. Past president of ASP, and I'm also a member of the social justice work group at NASP. So this, as Dr. Holland-Sims mentioned, this too is near and dear to my heart, and it's a pleasure to present to this. And I think this is a very important topic for us to be discussing and realizing the power that we as school psychologists bring to the table in terms of making meaningful change in the districts in which we work. So I look forward to sharing the information with you today.
Awesome. So before we get started, I just want to get a sense of who's in the room. I know this is a school psychologist training. However, I wonder if we have other roles in the house. So if there are different roles, could you go ahead and put them in the chat? That would be really helpful for Jason and I. In the meantime, I'm going to share my screen. Okay. So the Padlet that was placed into the chat feature has this as a PDF for you, and also some additional resources that both Jason and I thought would be important for you to have access to. And so just know that as we're going through it, if there are questions or different comments that you have, we do have our folks that are monitoring the chat, but we also just want you to be able to engage with us. As we were both saying before we began, this is weird to be in a virtual space and present together. The last time we presented together, we were at the Ask conference at State College. And so we could kind of bounce off each other and have a dialogue and engage. And so we're going to hope to do that in this virtual space, but your engagement will also help with that. So please, 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 if you have things you have questions about or just want to throw a comment out there, we want to take them. Okay. So you have met us, and so we thought it would be important to really anchor today's session with the National Association of School Psychologists' social justice definition. And the reason why we begin with this is because it's important for us to understand when we talk about equity, what does that really mean? And one of the things that I'm finding when I go across the Commonwealth virtually right now is that there's a range of understanding when it comes to that definition and how social justice is a part of the equitable practices journey. And so we thought that with NASP really honing in on the power of school psychology, that this definition really speaks to the efforts that we can do. So I'm going to read it out loud for us just for the purposes of, again, universal language and understanding. Social justice is both a process and a goal. So again, remember, it's a journey. It's not something that we can get to a finish line and say, okay, we did it, or we can check a box off and say, okay, we're now equitable. It's a continuous process and an ultimate goal that requires action. So just sitting around talking about it, admiring problems does not make social justice happen. School psychologists work to ensure the protection of the educational rights, opportunities, and well-being of all children, especially those whose voices have been, and I really think this is critical, muted, identities obscured, or needs ignored. You can probably, as you're sitting here, think of voices that fit in any one of those green spaces. Muted, identities obscured, or needs ignored. Social justice requires promoting non-discriminatory practices and the empowerment of families and communities, not just one-way communication, not just having parents come to a meeting and we tell them this is what the outcomes are for your child, empowering them to be active partners in the efforts that we do to ensure that they don't become muted voices in the process. School psychologists enact social justice through culturally responsive professional practice and advocacy to create schools, communities, and systems that ensure equity and fairness for all children and youth. One thing that's important to note with that word equity is that's different than equality. Often that gets very much conflated. And what we want to be clear about is that equity means making sure that students get what they need based on the needs that they present with at that right moment. And the best way to do that, and we'll talk about this, is through a multi-tiered system of support. That's that right moment for them to get what they need to be successful. If everyone got the same thing, that would be equality. And for too long, we've been focused on equality, and that's why we have to talk about disciplinary equity, because some students are not receiving what they need to be successful and therefore are the recipients of some pretty disparate outcomes. Jason, anything you want to add around that social justice definition from the NASP lens?
No, I think that your emphasis on, and I would really encourage people for the green categories, the muted, the identities obscured, or needs ignored, to really think about that and think honestly about that, and the populations that and people that you interface with that perhaps you don't think of as being muted or obscure. Because I think for me, even as you read it again, Nicole, today, and I've seen this many, many times, is that just really resonated with me again, because as I'm thinking about the folks that are listening this morning, is where are your blind spots? So who are you not thinking of that you might go, oh yeah, no, we're fine. But there are people that you interface with in your world that are muted and obscured. And that's a huge, huge issue. And in terms of equity, I think the fact that the promotion of the MTSS, that really helps us to conceptualize how to do this in an equitable manner, how to approach working with students and families in an equitable manner. So I think that's, yeah, I just really encourage you to be thoughtful about who you might be not thinking of, and expanding your thinking and to include a lot of different groups in those muted, identity, obscured, and ignored.
Thank you. So I think with that in mind, we can anchor ourselves around the rest of the content that Jason and I are going to take you through. As we said, the title of today's session is around disciplinary equity. And one thing that I want to be clear on is that equity doesn't just belong in discipline. As you'll see, it really intersects with many different facets of our educational system. Where we're seeing a lot of disproportionality or overrepresentation of certain groups is in the discipline world. And so that's why we wanted to spend time and really think about the expansion of the role of the school psychologist to help support disciplinary equity practices. Because we have such a skill set, I often shared, and I have with Jason before, that school psychologists were systems level thinkers. And that's not something everyone can say in a school setting. And so we see the global picture. And that's why this definition also resonates, because we're able to say, what do we have control over it within our locus of control to make these outcomes better for those students in the green? Okay, take a minute and take a look at this quote from James Baldwin. And in the chat, tell me how this is resonating with you. When you read it, what comes to mind? No right or wrong answer. Just want to see what your thoughts are. And as we wait for type time, this is the awkward Zoom silence. Okay, thanks, Steph. Facing equity can be a challenge, especially for those who identify as white. Wow. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. You can only change your own actions in response to problems. It makes me think of AA. First step is to acknowledge. Oh, thank you guys for putting these in. We're going to take a few of them. Yep. You can't make a change without trying anything. Thanks, Becky. Silence is agreement. There's still a lot in our culture that we need to face. We need action, not just talking about it. This is great. Thank you guys. Keep them coming. As I said, this helps Jason and I to really get pumped up and get started on this effort. We need to have uncomfortable conversations to start. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
So when we think about James Baldwin, and I'm not sure how many of you know who he is. If someone knows that, that's your trivia for today. You can put that in the chat too. But James Baldwin is someone that I highly admire. And unfortunately, he's not with us anymore. But if you ever were to Google him or watch him on YouTube, you can actually search for him doing a debate at Oxford University in 1965. And that was, at that time, unprecedented that he was able to stand up there and the debate, and I have to recall the exact kind of topic they were talking through, but it was about, and it may be this, being Black in America. And so there was a gentleman on the other side of the debate who was arguing, differences and saying, America has grown, it's evolved, and it's better for the Black man now. And James Baldwin, on the other hand, was arguing, or I should say debating, that things hadn't really changed all that much. And with that, he was saying that there was so much more work that could be done. And it sounds familiar because some of you actually put that in the chat. And as I watched that, knowing that it's 1965, James Baldwin could come into this session right now and be right online with what we're dealing with as a country. Like, that's how progressive he was in his thinking. And so this quote resonates with me in the work that we do around equity and social justice, because for so long we've sat in a space of comfort or complacency around this effort and just say, oh, well, it's the parents. Oh, it's just those kids. When really we have to start pulling back the curtain, if you will, to think about systemically what has caused some of these outcomes and how can we address them.
Now, Nicole, actually, I've watched the debate. So
Did
before you
you?
move on, I would jump in and say
Yeah.
that I agree that James Baldwin is very progressive, but my other flip side of that coin that actually saddened me a bit was I was shocked at how little progress we've made.
Mm-hmm.
But the things that he said were resonate as if the conversation were happening right now.
Yeah.
And in fact, the things that the other gentleman, William F. Buckley, was debating, I've heard people say on the news. I've heard people comment today. And so that was 1965 versus 2021. And they are almost identical, the things that have been said. And it was just stunning to me. So
I'm
it's
so glad that you said that, because William F. Buckley, I could not recall his name. So yeah, that was the gentleman who was debating James Baldwin. And it just make you go, wow, because I felt the same. I was like, this could be right now. We could have this same exact conversation. And it is disheartening, but it also, for me, kind of said, I want to do more. Like, I can't just be complacent. I have to do more, because if 1965 to now hasn't changed anything, we're the change agents. Like, we have to embrace that title. So if we're making small dents, we're making a dent nonetheless. So let's think of this question, folks. What contributes to disproportionality? And again, the chat is open, and I would love to hear what you think. And then we'll tell you what we think. But what do you think contributes to disproportionality? Thank you, Susan. Bias. What else? Mindset, income. Yep. Thanks, Sarah. The idea of fairness, bias. Let's keep them coming. Color blindness. Thank you, Gina. Yep. Denial. Systemic barriers. Yep. Systemic racism. Not understanding the difference between equity and equality. Lack of access. Disadvantages. Take one more and then we'll showcase what we think. Lack of action, failure to listen, vulnerable decision points. Erica's getting to it. Let's do it. Okay, historical practices. Yes, these are all great. Thank you, guys. So what you can see here is that disproportionality is complex. And the reason why I like this particular graphic is that oftentimes when we think about disproportionality, we go to, well, it's that teacher, or it's that building, or it's that administrator. And really, this speaks to systems, right? So when you look at this global picture, all of those contributing factors give us disproportionate outcomes. And again, what I want you to do, even though this is a disciplinary equity session, I want you to go beyond that. So you'll notice some things that might resonate, school psychologists, with a lot of us. So let's look at interventions and referrals, the green on the left. That contributes to disproportionality in special education. And you may say, Nicole, what do you mean? I feel like I'm preaching to a choir, because we know that we get referrals all the time that may or may not have had appropriate intervention, or may or may not have been given the amount of time needed to ensure that the referral is appropriate. And so with that, with those referrals coming, we may be making decisions that contribute to students of certain groups being overrepresented or underrepresented in special education systems. That's one piece of disproportionality. Another piece that we talk about is instruction and assessment. So as teachers are giving instruction to students, are our curriculums designed to support our neediest students? Are they addressing those needs appropriately? So that's another key point. Are our teachers highly qualified that are in front of our neediest students? And then as we assess students, are our assessments biased? And we could spend an entire day, school psychologists, right, on that component alone, and how we make decisions on things that may not have been normed on students that we're serving. In addition to that, we can talk about families and communities, and that's that systemic kind of societal piece. educational opportunity, which, if nothing else, when you hear the word equity, I want you to put access and opportunity together, because they both have to coexist for equity to take place. Students need access, but they also need the opportunity to access what they need. So that opportunity piece, I would like for us to move away from saying achievement gap and say opportunity gaps, because opportunity gaps speak to the system being defunct, if you will, or not working, rather than putting blame on the individual student, which becomes the achievement gap. We also could talk about teacher expectations and misconceptions. A lot of you highlighted bias. That's where that sort of sits, along with cultural dissonance. So we know this thing about cognitive dissonance, Psych 101, right? So when we're interacting with people and they don't present in the way that we anticipate, or we're given something that kind of shifts our thinking, it makes us have dissonance, and we have to wrestle with that. Cultural dissonance is very similar. And so when we think about bias, that's what we see. So there's an author, and I have to pull it for us, but she has a YouTube video talking about avoiding the single story. And so the single story essentially translates into stereotyping. And she's from Africa. And so she comes to America, and she's in college, and she has a college roommate, and her college roommate says, can you teach me some of your tribal songs? And she says this person was shocked by that, but then also was quick, because she said to the roommate, sure, you want to listen to Mariah Carey? To say, I listen to the same thing you listen to, but your stereotype, your single story of Africans was that we're tribal, or we only listen or eat certain food. And so the roommate was like shocked that that was the comment. That roommate was experiencing cultural dissonance, having something that she thought was accurate, not being accurate, and having to wrestle with that in that moment. Socio Demographics, we can talk about that as far as society, the haves, the have-nots, depending on the zip code you're in. We could spend another day talking about funding for districts across the country and how some districts get more than others. It really contributes to disproportionality. And the last one that I'm going to hit on is discipline, policies, and practices. And that is going to be part of what Jason and I really highlight, in the fact that zero tolerance policies, things that really sort of are racist in nature systemically, or sexist in nature, or homophobic in nature, transphobic in nature, can contribute to disproportionate outcomes from a disciplinary lens. Jason, I saw you unmuted. Go for it.
Well, I was just going to say, and it's something we're not going to touch on a ton here, but there's a lot of intersectionality among everything Nicole just went through.
Mm-hmm.
So you can take every one of those boxes and then layer them on one another. So you're looking at race, ethnicity, and poverty, and gender, and just stack them all up and think about the outcomes that you get as a result of that, and the impact on equity that it has there. And I'm so glad you brought up Psych 101, because as you were talking about just about the interventions and teacher expectations, my mind was going to the Pygmalion studies. You know, when and for those of you who may not recall, it might have been a while, I know it was for me, that's where the researchers basically told the teachers that they had tested all these students of the entire grade level ahead of time. They said this portion of the population scored really high in the IQ measure and are going to have really great achievement throughout the year. This group, not so much. And they were all kids were just randomly assigned. They weren't even, and then they went through and they found out that the students that the teachers were told would be able to achieve higher, in fact, did achieve higher statistically relative to the population they were told didn't. And there were no differences among them to start. So if you don't think that these biases sort of can leak in and be there, we have a lot of research that you might not necessarily consider immediately to be equity related that relates to that, and how different factors impact your decision making. There was a study that I co-authored years ago on making determinations on eligibility for emotional disturbance based on the presence or absence of a psychiatric diagnosis. Again, what you found was that the presence of that diagnosis disproportionately impacted the decision-making process when all other factors remained the same in these vignettes. School psychologists, and we did this survey with school psychologists, so all of us, had their decision-making biased by that piece of information. So there's a lot of bias that exists there that you have to be aware of in terms of how these things intersect in the decision-making that you're making. So just that's something to be aware of as we go through.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. It looks like there was a question. What was the name of that study pointing out the academic decision-making bias? I would love to take it to our administrative team.
I'll find it and get it for you. Give me a
Okay,
minute.
thanks. Okay, so culturally responsive practices in education. I don't want to, but I'm going to kind of breeze through this because I want us to get to some of the core pieces of why you're here today, which is disciplinary equity. And I think for some of us, these may seem normal or things that we do on a regular basis, but it still bears repeating for a lot of us. And so when we look at what are culturally responsive educational systems, I often joke when I share this that we always have to have an obligatory shape to represent something in education. And so what we have here are circles that intersect. And when we look, we have three P's, which are people, policies, and practices. And what I want us to keep in mind as school psychologists, as others that are in various roles of related service or supporting student services in general, we have to understand that the only way in a lot of cases that practices are changed or influenced is by policy. And so you may say, I don't have any stake in policy. I don't help make policy. You, as an individual in that system, you're the people. So you do have the opportunity to influence policy by advocating. And remember that social justice definition? That's where school psychologists also can expand the role and be vocal about what's needed for students that they're serving. And when those policies are then put in place, whether they're at the LEA level, whether they're at the school board level, whether they're at federal, state level, then the practices are shaped and able to be put in place. So what does this mean in the classroom? So what you saw was the overall global piece. And just really quickly, what I want to highlight is that there's cultures in the classroom. So this is what we each bring into the space. There's the classroom culture, so what's already there. So as we think about the way classrooms are designed, which is very antiquated in a lot of ways, but the rows and the desk, having the board at the front, having maybe the teacher standing up front lecturing, that's what's already there. When those things come together, it creates the work that people do together, which creates specific classroom cultures. I know that when I think about my time in my district that I served as a school psychologist, walking down the hall to observe students, and you knew the cultures of each classroom that you were walking by. You knew how that teacher held court, if you will. You knew how the students interacted in that space. And so that's what kind of is birthed out of those two things coming together, what teachers and students bring, and then what's already there. And so what is culturally responsive pedagogy? It's essentially student-centered. And so why we're sharing all of this is really to lay foundation on how we can create spaces to reduce students seeking to be out of the system or not feeling that they belong in the system, which all lends itself to positive school climate and having disciplinary equitable decisions. So when we look at this culturally responsive pedagogy, it's where students are affirmed essentially, and that their identities are made to feel that they are a part of the space. So they have a place in the world. And in that place in the world, we know schools are microcosms of society. So that place in the world is in that classroom so that they have that space where they can be their authentic selves. That doesn't always happen. And that's why a lot of students aren't very happy in the system that they're in. One of the number one reasons in a study in 2016-17, Pennsylvania data, one reason why students said that they dropped out of school was simply, I don't like school. And when you unpack that, that speaks to, did I have a sense of connection to that school? Did I have established positive relationships with people at that school? And so culturally responsive pedagogy, when instructing, allows for that to potentially take place for students that are otherwise othered. And so this may look familiar to some of you. This is the Danielson Framework. And so we just wanted to highlight that there are things in each one of those domains that really speak to equitable practices. So knowledge of students, creating an environment of respect and rapport, establishing a culture of learning, communicating with families, growing ourselves professionally, communicating with students, and then demonstrating flexibility and responsiveness. So what are the characteristics of culturally responsive teaching? You may say, yeah, you say we should affirm students, but how? what do we do, or how do we help teachers know what to do? So as school psychologists, these are things that we could give teachers as strategies. Communication of high expectations is one. And so I'm starting with that because I think at the core, that can be part of that bias discussion that may influence the expectations given to students. So when we set the bar low, what do people do? Meet us at that bar. So the communication of high expectations is critical. We can't always come in with a savior complex and say, oh, those poor kids. That's already lowering the bar. That's already saying we don't expect much from them. And so we have to be cognizant of those mindsets when we're thinking about culturally responsive. Jason, I saw you on mute.
Well, yeah, and I also, like, the concern I have, I think it's an imperative that people communicate high expectations, but I also think it's critical about how you communicate those high expectations.
Good point.
I've often seen folks use high expectations as the blunt instrument that they beat over the child's head, as opposed to saying, I expect that you can do that. So it's not just saying you have to achieve X. It's saying I want you and believe that you can achieve X, and I will help you to get there. It's not simply saying this is the threshold. You have to make it on your own. We don't communicate that to anybody, but we especially do that in biased ways with traditionally minoritized populations, is that we don't necessarily communicate that we are expecting that to happen and believing that can happen, and showing that we will support you to reach that threshold.
Good point. Excellent point. So the rest of these are really tied together. So I'm not going to spend a ton of time going one by one. But essentially, what this is saying is that we want to be able to provide opportunities for students to see themselves in the content and also have windows out so that they have exposure to different experiences. And so when we think about that, it's often titled Mirrors and Windows. If you're not familiar with mirrors and windows, it's simply what I just articulated. So as a Black student, when I was a student, it was rare that I saw myself in the content being delivered, whether that was science, history, ELA, math, what have you. As an adult, I look back on that and I go, wow, I learned more about myself from my family, from that teaching that I got from my family, rather than when I was sitting in the school. Whereas my peers saw themselves all the time. And so the other part that I would say is one thing I'm seeing with a lot of districts now are alum coming back to them and saying, you really didn't prepare us for the quote unquote real world because we never were exposed to people who were different. And many of us have experienced culture shock now going into our career or going to college. And so if these criteria or these steps are put in place, it allows for those mirror and window experiences to happen. And why I share that is because white students or dominant culture students still need windows to see out and to see those different experiences in real time and understand that people do have those differences and that it's okay to have those differences. And so I think it's important as we think about reshaping curriculum, as we think about being culturally mediated with our instruction and student centered, that's what all of that connects to. Additionally, letting the students drive the efforts. So instead of being sage on the stage as teachers, how can we be facilitators as educators and ensure that students have voice in the content that they're being instructed with? The top one I kind of took some time on because I think it's one that takes a lot of time for people to grasp. Positive perspectives on parents and families. Sounds easy, right? We all love our families. They're not difficult. Not true. We encounter families that really give us a run for our money sometimes. And it's hard often to form positive perspectives. And because of those perspectives, we tend to start to get biased in nature around certain families, around certain backgrounds that connect to those families. And in a moment, we'll talk about vulnerable decision points and how those play a role in that perspective that we take. So I often share this example. When I was a school psychologist, we all can appreciate this, I hope. You need to get things signed, right? And you got to get them signed by a certain time or you're out of compliance. And that is a big no-no, right? So when I was a school psychologist, I needed to have a meeting with a parent. and I needed her to sign this ER so that we could move on and get ready for the IEP meeting. She refused to come in, and I couldn't understand why. And I'm reaching out to her, and she's like, finally, she says, I'm not coming here or coming to the building until X person is there. And in this case, her name was Yolanda. Yolanda was the special education facilitator. And for whatever reason, this parent had a rapport with Yolanda that she did not have with me. So her comfort level in coming to the building was only there when Yolanda was present. So I worked magic. I tried my best to get Yolanda to be there on the day of that meeting. And everything was all set. The day of the meeting comes, mom shows up, walks in, and Yolanda's not there because unfortunately, Yolanda had to take a sick day that day because her son was ill. And I was like, well, she's coming anyway. It'll be okay. I'll explain that Yolanda's son is sick. It'll be fine. She comes in. She takes one look at the table, doesn't see Yolanda, and is like, I'm out, and walks out. And I'm like, what have I done to this lady? The catty part of me, and why I'm sharing this is because positive perspectives, right? The catty part of me said, I can't believe she just won't sit down and sign this for her son. Does she care? Immediately. That was the first line of thinking. Then I went a little bit more catty and I said, and she's showing up here in pajamas. Who does she think she is? That's disrespectful. So all of those biases or all of those perspectives that I have about what constitute a respectable parent, a caring parent, I put onto this mom. Once I talked to Yolanda, she shared with me that this parent was a former student of hers in special education. And so this parent had not the best experience with the school system. And she only felt comfortable with this person. And so I had to kind of eat crow and kind of slap my hand a little bit and say, how dare you, Nicole, pass judgment on this lady for what she's wearing? She at least was trying to show up to sign off for her student or her child, but she just didn't know how to go about it without Yolanda there. So I share all of that to say that positive perspective really can make or break how we interact with families and parents, and then how we translate what we do in supporting the students that they come from. So I just wanted to share that story as we think about what that could look like and how easy it is to fall into the trap of holding a negative bias about a family. Jason, did you have anything else you wanted to add?
Absolutely, lots. Because I somebody did post in the chat that the I will say the myth of the difficult parent or the mindset of the difficult parent is a danger, and it is. And I would also argue that there are a lot of parents. We get caught up in our own little bubble, and we have our own educational echo chamber.
Yep.
Which is that we understand what we're doing. We understand the importance of it. We know the process. The process is smooth. It runs. It's quick. It's really, this is not that big a deal. Let's just do it, boom. These are people's children. And so this is very, very important for them. And this is the biggest decision, one of the biggest decisions they're making for their child, probably that academic year. Whereas for you, it might be the fifth one that day. So don't lose sight of that's very important to them. And also that a lot of our families who can't come in for meetings have jobs that don't permit them to come in. So you're asking a parent to decide, do I feed my child? Because they might have to take off a whole day of work, so they lose that income for a half an hour meeting, maybe an hour at the most, or do I sign this paperwork? What is the trade-off there? And we have to be sensitive and recognize that those are things that factor into their lives. It's their own educational experience, their own circumstances in that moment, their own resources. Are they able to do that? That's a big deal. And I think, as I've said many times about this pandemic, it's flipped over the rock. All of the negative, ugly underside of things that we've ignored for years about our systems have been laid bare by all of this. Excuse me. The fact that we're doing this, the way we're doing this, is a luxury. Yeah. How many families are not able to do this? I know where we're working, we're all excited because we can have Zoom IEP meetings with parents, and it'll be easier for them. For some. So these are biases that enter in, and these are problems that we don't even consider in terms of that we think about. We come in with our negative perspectives already. We're making assumptions already about the parents, about families, about students. And I think, Nicole, you mentioned something I wanted to speak to about engage in the student's perspective and their lens on it.
Yeah.
How many times have you actually asked a student about their thoughts about school when you're doing an evaluation for them? How many times have you actually stopped and said, how are things going? How many times have you made decisions or worked with the entire team, including the parents, to make decisions for a child, and never once got the perspective of the child in that situation to know what they're feeling about how school goes and what they see as being the problems? I mean, because their experience is, as you know, I mean, if you think about it, we always say that we don't know everything that goes on in schools. The kids really know. Yeah, but you never actually ask them what's going on, how they're experiencing that. So that's critically important, particularly for populations that are ignored, obscured, and muted.
So true. So that was actually a perfect segue, because now we're talking about engagement. So as we think about engagement, it speaks to what Jason just highlighted. How do we know if students are actively engaged in the school system? And we have to ask them. But there's certain things that are observable that we can, just by looking can tell if they're engaged, and other things that are not so easy to know. And so we have to do that deep dive and ask those questions. So one of the things that comes from Check and Connect, if you're familiar with Check and Connect out of the University of Minnesota, is this thought about school completion and preventing dropout. And engagement is one of those key contributors on whether or not a student will complete or drop out. So what I'd like for us to do, and this is an activity, but we're not going to do it in the way we've done it before. We're looking at 4 categories or characteristics of engagement by subtype. So academic, behavioral, cognitive, and affective. Before I go to the next slide, I'd like for you to put in the chat which characteristics, or which subtypes I should say, rephrase, which subtypes out of these 4 are observable. Put them in the chat for me. Thanks, Zach. Behavioral, academic, behavioral and academic. Thanks, Lorraine. Yep. Yes, and you're absolutely right. So the 2 that are observable are academic and behavioral. What I'm getting at is that the cognitive piece and the affective piece are not really easy to see. And so these are the 2 that we have to really think about when we're looking at deep diving around our discipline data. And so I want to show you a table that essentially tells us how to think about observing some of those things that are not so easy to know. So academic and behavioral, we have time on task for academic, we have attendance, fewer suspensions for behavioral, classroom participation. When we look at cognitive and affective, remember I said how important it is for students to see themselves? That is the cognitive engagement. Perceive relevance. So is this relevant to me? Can I connect to it? Why am I learning about this? How does it impact me and the life that I live? The goal of education, among other things, is to produce self-regulated learners. So cognitively, we want self-regulation towards goals. So if they have lifelong goals or goals for the year, goals for the semester, do they have the skills to be able to do that effort and regulate themselves to get there? And of course, metacognition, our thinking about thinking. Affective, this is where I really like to spend some time. How do they identify with school? Are they going to extracurricular activities? Do they join the teams? Do they want to be a part of the clubs? Or do they see it as not for them? And if so, why? That goes to belonging. One of the key definitions of belonging that I would encourage us to think about is from Floyd Cobb and John Crownapple. And they articulate belonging because often we think of it as, oh, it's sense of belonging, and we kind of fluff it. But I like their definition because they say it's the ability to feel as though you don't have to worry about being perceived as a stereotype, and you can be authentic in your multidimensional personhood. And I love that definition because it really speaks to the fact of being authentically you, and that no matter what, when you come into this space, you can say and do whatever, and you won't have to worry about us labeling you. You won't have to worry about us assuming that you come from this background or that this is how all of you act. That sense of belonging is critical. And then perceived connection with teachers and peers. So that's that relationship That is extremely important. So the other side of the table, I won't spend a ton of time here, but these are the ways that these things can be facilitated. So as I said, academic and behavioral are really observable, and we know different ways to approach that. Cognitive and affective are not so easy. But as we think about cognitive, it's using problem solving skills. So as we think about social emotional learning, it's all embedded in that. How are we building students up to be able to engage in those processes of self awareness, self monitoring, etc.? Creating an active interest in learning. And then affective, increasing support from parents and teachers. So one thing that we know from the Check and Connect world that I love about that intervention is that the family engagement component is built into it because we want to have a circle or a system of care around those students. So that increased support is critical. And then building personal relationships with marginalized students. So part of why we're here today is to speak about that piece of belonging for students that are typically on the margins.
I love that definition of belonging, because I agree.
Yeah.
When people hear belonging, they think of sunshine and roses and rainbows and unicorns and all the stuff. That's not, there's no meat to that. And that is probably one of the single biggest factors that impacts performance, is they feel like they belong in that environment. So
Right.
reflect in your own life. Has there been a time where you walked into a room and didn't feel like this was the right place for you? Maybe it was a bit more posh than you're used to, or something, or whatever. And you walk in, I'll share a funny example. I know a friend who walked in, there's a dive bar here in Hershey, that I'm not going to name. But it's pretty rough. It was really, really rough. And so this person was meeting a friend there they hadn't seen in several years, and they were wearing a blazer. And they walked into the bar, and everybody at the bar kind of turned and looked at them like, what are you doing here? And I won't share what the people said or what the exchange that took place. It was fairly entertaining, but the person felt very uncomfortable even meeting their friend there. That's just a bar. Imagine if that's how you feel walking into school every day, that everybody turns and looks at you and you don't feel like you're a part of that environment.
That's right.
It's
That's
not
right.
a small thing. So please don't underestimate it or pass it off as being this pie in the sky kind of notion.
Absolutely. And there was a request in the chat for the definition to be shared again. So when we take a break, I'll go ahead and type that in the chat because I want to get it authentically from the author. So I'll make sure I do that. Thanks, Becky. Okay, so elements of culturally competent leadership. The reason I think it's important to share this is because as school psychologists, we are the systems change agents, right? We're the systems level thinkers, which makes us natural born leaders, whether we want to be or not. And so as we think about that, I want us to start unpacking, what does that mean to be a culturally competent leader? Some of these key components are listed here for you. And this comes out of the work of Randall Lindsay on cultural proficiency and leadership. And so I'm going to take one by one. I'm not going to spend a ton of time, but I do want us to unpack these. So the first one is to assess your own culture. And what I can say to this is not only the culture you internally hold, but also the culture of your building, the culture of your district. Assess it. Determine what are the things that make me who I am. And in a moment, we're going to do a short activity called the social identity wheel that helps you to begin to do that. Assessing who you are. What makes Jason Jason? What makes Nicole Nicole? What makes Erica Erica? We all have different pieces that I often say are part of our backpack or part of our briefcase, and it determines who we are. We have to start there in order to know how to be culturally competent in our leadership. We also have to value diversity. And so that sounds cliche, right? That sounds like, oh, everybody hold hands and we are the world. No, it's more than that. It's saying that the diversity that we have, whatever that is in your respective settings, because I want to make it clear too, when we say culture, we're not talking race, ethnicity only. We're talking many different facets that make up a culture. And so diversity is that as well. One thing I want to say, just having diversity isn't enough. Diversity says, here's one person or two people that meet our quota. That's diversity. When there's a voice given or the allowance of a voice given, that might be inclusion. And when that voice is heard and able to interact with other people and have the ability to create action, that's equity. So when we value diversity, we're not tokenizing it. We're actually saying that we want it, we need it, and it's the best way for us to move. Additionally, how do we adapt to diversity? So once we have it, how do we ensure that it's utilized in an appropriate way? So the book gives the kind of analogy that if you are a partner in a dance, so if we're dancing together and my husband goes to the left and I go to the right and we're swaying back and forth, we're following each other and we're in step and in sync because I'm now adapting to the movement of my husband. That's adapting to diversity, not being stuck in my rigid way and not moving, and then we can't dance. So in order for us to dance effectively, we have to be able to ebb and flow, adjust, and make the changes necessary to ensure that we're valuing, but also ensuring that those voices are valued. And then managing the dynamics of difference, not easy by any means, not easy by any means. So you have people who are coming into your systems or meeting you for the first time, and there's differences already. Remember, we talked about cultural dissonance. How do you as a leader understand that, view it, acknowledge it, and be able to manage it? So when you have, and I'm just going to use principals as an example, when you have a principal who has a teacher who says, student A, I'm done, they're out of my room. Student comes to principal and says, the teacher doesn't like me. We're now in managing the dynamics of difference because there's probably a miscommunication or a bias that could be at play here. How do we as leaders stay neutral enough to be able to engage around that issue and make it so that both people feel heard, but also ensure that there is a fair approach to whatever decision we make? That's managing the dynamics of difference, ensuring that the voices, again, are valued, adapted, and that we're ensuring that we're not being one-sided in the way that we make decisions. That then lends itself to institutionalizing cultural knowledge. And you may say, that sounds like a mouthful. What does that mean? That means it becomes the fabric of everything we do. It's institutionalized, it's policy, it's holding us accountable, it's ensuring that this happens no matter who the principal or the leader is. The capacity is built that it's just the fabric of everything we do. Okay, who are you? Quick activity. Suppose you are on a boat with your mother, your spouse, and your child. Suddenly the boat begins to sink. You determine that you can save only one of the other passengers. Whom do you save? If you could put that in the chat, that would be great. Child is coming up quick.
Mm-hmm.
Yep, a lot of kids. Yep, someone said tough, but child. Yeah, it is a very tough question.
Tough, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Oh, Jenna, that's a great question. There's no right or wrong answer, so whatever you say. All right, so I'm getting the sense from a lot of folks that child is who they would save. And the reason I pose this is because, as you can see at the top, it says cultural competence. And you may say, I don't really get how this has to do with that. But what it means is, at our basic level of thinking, which is survival, we still operate from a culturally bound space. And you may say, okay, help me understand. What I mean by that is, with this question is posed to people who are not American, they live in Eastern parts of the world, the overwhelming response is mother. And the rationale is, I can have another baby, I can marry someone else, but I only get one mom. And typically in those cultures, the mother is a very esteemed role. In America, we are very child-centered, oftentimes. And so it's not uncommon to see what we just saw here. Sorry, that was on a timer. So it's not uncommon for us to see what we saw here, which was the child. And Kelly, thank you. Yes, it does assume that people have all those relationships. And that's why there's no right or wrong answer with this one. It's just simply to see kind of where people immediately go to. And so as we think about that and the culturally bound nature of it, it speaks to the fact that when we're competent culturally, if someone were to say, I'm saving my mom and not my child, we would have enough cultural humility, being humble enough to say, Wow, that's interesting. I probably would have saved my child, but we don't repress that person. We don't make that person feel bad for what they said because their culture deemed their response. And what we see in schools is this thought of if they don't fit within our cultural norm and they're so different, we find fault. And that's why it's important that at our basic level of thinking, survival, it's culturally bound typically. There's nothing wrong with the answers people gave. It's just letting you know that those are the core thinking processes that we all have that really influence our decisions. So that brings, go ahead, Jason.
I was just to say, it reminded me of years ago, I saw a presenter, his name was Alan November, and he was talking about from just a cultural lens, just historical events
Mhm.
and just how they're viewed differently depending on the culture that you come from, like internationally even he was talking. So, and I'm going to date myself with this reference because probably most people don't remember the embassy, American embassy in Iran being um, captured and hostages taken in 1979. And so we refer to that as the hostage crisis. That's not how the Iranians refer to it. They refer to it as the invasion of the Americans because we tried to go in and rescue them, and it was a failed operation, et cetera. And so that's it. And I bring it up, and it's not to be political or controversial, but it's the exact same event from two different cultures and how it is viewed. And there are many examples of that you can find. Things that we think of as being something that really resonates with us as Americans, or pick a cultural group that is viewed entirely differently by a different group and is massively different just based on their perspective and their world experience. And that's not a small thing, but it's something that we don't often think of, that there are, how often do we work with children on the spectrum and say, one of the things we want to work on is perspective taking. Do we do that ourselves? How often do we take others' perspectives? And that's really a bit of what this touches on. So sorry, Nicole, go ahead.
No, sorry. That's perfect. That helps to just bring it full circle because that then speaks to what's in your backpack. So remember I said your backpack or your briefcase, it's what makes you who you are. So your family values, your past experiences, your country of origin, biases that you may have, privileges that you may have, all exist as contents in your backpack or your briefcase. And because of that, how you show up to people may be one thing and how they show up to you may be another. So we want to start to think about that and why we're doing all of this front loading, because you may say you haven't touched discipline yet, because we need you to understand that these are the components that are necessary to even be able to look at the data through an equity mindset. Because if you don't have this background, our mindset will still be one of, well, this is just it's a student issue. It's not a system issue. Okay, so what I'd like for us to do is think about what's called the 3 C's of identity. So as I'm going through these, think about yourself, and then in a moment, we're going to do an activity. So C, corner. Corner is, you've heard people say, your corner of the globe. It's essentially your citizenship. So Jason just said a very clear example. The Iranians felt one way about that incident. Americans felt a different way about that incident, depending upon the corner of the world that people exist. And so this is your country of origin, typically. Culture, as I said, does not just mean race, ethnicity, it's broad. And so what it means here is how we live on a daily basis, thinking about our ancestry, our religion, our food, dress, musical taste, traditions, political and social affiliations, and even recreation. And then lastly, C for color. I'm not sure if you've seen, but Sesame Street just recently added a character or a Muppet to the Sesame Street group that is a Black boy. And in talking to Elmo, and I'm sharing this because I have a 3-year-old son, so forgive me, it's all I watch. But I was so intrigued by it because they were introducing discussions about race on Sesame Street, and I thought it was appropriate the way they did it. They focused on melanin. Because Elmo came and said, I forget the child's name. Let's just say his name is CJ, because that's my son's name. Comes up to CJ and says, CJ, the leaves on the trees are falling down and some are red and some are brown like CJ's skin, or red like Elmo's fur. And so the dad explains to Elmo and his son that that's based on melanin. So how much melanin people have on their skin determines the color of the skin. And so we can talk about that and think about how in our society, there's such a thing as a color line. And so my colleague, one of our colleagues who is School Psych of the Year, by the way, Dr. Amber Sessoms, she talks about often in our society, we focus on proximity to whiteness. And so when we look at color, there's an activity that you can do called the color line where people rate themselves on experiences they've had. And what they found in that work is that often the folks who have not really experienced a lot of oppressive systems, whether that's colorism, racism, sexism, tended to be fairer in complexion. Those that experience more of those tended to be darker in complexion. And so that's society, but it also shapes who we are and the identities that we hold. And so I just wanted to offer those. And this comes from Glenn Singleton, who does Courageous Conversations About Race. Okay, if we were all together in person, I would have a nice little handy dandy handout for you that has this on it. And I would be asking you to look at those different pieces of the social identity wheel and indicate what connects to you. So if I'm completing this, like we would give people time, and I'm going to give you some time to write on a piece of paper or type somewhere, not in chat, how these connect. So if I were doing it, I would say my age is 40, my national origin is USA, my home language is English, I identify as a female. Race, I can say I'm a Black woman. I don't know my ethnicity. I really don't. And that is a piece of this whole puzzle of identifying who you are. My religion, I identify as Christian, I identify as heterosexual, and as far as my ability, I consider myself to be able-bodied, both developmentally, emotionally, and physically. Take some time now, and as you're looking at that, write out how you identify. And as I said, it's okay if some of these you don't know. And then it's 9:33. At about 9:36, we'll come back and I have a couple probing questions for you. So let's take the time to do that. About another minute, if you just want to wrap up. Okay, All right, for sake of time, I'm going to keep moving. If you've written down the different identities that you associate with, I have a couple probing questions that I just want to pose to you. So if you would indulge me, if you could place a check mark next to the identities you think about the most often. Remember that definition of belonging, and Jason said about the dive bar and walking in and being very keenly aware that you're different? What are those identities for you that you're most keenly aware of when you walk into spaces? And if you don't have any, that's okay too. Just if you could indulge me and put a check mark next to those that you think about the most often. Okay, this next question typically creates some angst, so I'm just going to say that at the onset. If you were to eliminate two identities, which would they be? So I'm going to ask you to put an X through two identities that you would get rid of or be willing to eliminate. And as you're thinking about that, why did you choose to give up those identities? Then the last piece is if you could put a star next to the identities that you refuse to give up, regardless of the demands placed on you. And I'll repeat that question. If you could put a star next to the identities that you refuse to give up, regardless of the demands placed on you. And I'm going to take a risk here and ask someone to put in the chat, if they're comfortable, the two identities they were willing to give away. Age and race. Thanks, Patrice. Age and race, sexual orientation, national origin. Thanks, Zach. Age and ethnicity, age and national origin. A lot of age. That tends to be what we see. Age and religion, race, sexual orientation. Thanks, Sarah. Home language, national origin. Ability, age and national origin. Age and religion. Okay, this is great. Thank you guys for sharing these. Could the next set of responses be the identities you refuse to give up now? Which ones would you refuse to give up? Religion, yep. Gender and religion, religion and ability, sexual orientation and gender, ability, gender and sexual orientation, ability and gender, religion, gender and religion. Thank you guys. Physical disability, gender, native language. Thank you for sharing these. So the reason why we wanted to, again, take you through this process is, number one, for you to assess your own culture. Remember, that was one of the essential elements. So as you're assessing your own culture, we wanted you to think about the things that really make you you and that you're really tied to, that mean so much to you. What I want you to do now is think about, in our school settings, the things that we ask students to give up, even if we don't intend to. So if someone can put in the chat, what are some of the identities we ask our students to give up when they walk through our doors? Race, home language, ethnicity. Yep. Religion, gender, sexual orientation. Especially if non-binary. Yes, Kelly, thank you for that. Religion. Yep. Thank you, Zach. Yes, Ramadan is coming. So there will be a lot of students that are going to feel othered in our elementary schools. I can share, I know Jason won't mind me sharing this. We were in a meeting together a while ago, and there was talk about Christmas trees in the office every Christmas, and how, while we as Christians don't mind that, we love it, there are students that may not celebrate Christmas, and that kind of insinuates you're othered, you're different. Someone on a recent podcast shared about St. Patrick's Day, and they said to someone who's not Irish, "Why aren't you wearing green?" Or "Why didn't the leprechaun visit you?" And a child came home and said, "Mommy, why didn't the leprechaun visit us?" And the mom had to explain, we don't celebrate St. Patrick's Day. And so I'm not saying that we have to now do away with all of the fun things that we do. It's just being aware, having awareness that there are students with differences, and we sometimes ask them to give up some of those differences to fit in or assimilate. Okay, this was a good response for us. Thank you. Jason, did you have anything to add for this?
Well, I love the exercise, and I don't know why today made me think of, probably because it's relatively close in proximity. I don't know if folks remember, there was an athlete named Jim Thorpe. There's a town called Jim Thorpe named in his honor.
Yep.
That was a phenomenal athlete at the turn of the last century. And he was amazing, but he went to the Carlisle Normal School, I believe is what it was.
Yep.
And for those of you who don't know, Jim Thorpe, I don't remember, he was Native American. I don't recall exactly which tribe, but the Carlisle Normal School, basically when he went there, outlawed, he had to cut his hair, and as all the students did, and they were forbidden to speak in their native language. So I bring that up because people hear that and they say, "Oh, that's terrible, and that's so antiquated as a practice." My question for you and challenge for you as you think about these, as reflect on this, is based on a number of items that I saw fly up in that chat, is how often do we do the same thing when it comes to language or other cultural aspects that students have? I mean, wasn't there a news story not too long ago about a child having his dreadlocks cut off in school by the principal, as I recall? So I challenge you to say that those notions, again, so similar to the debate we talked earlier about with James Baldwin and William F. Buckley Jr., is that these ideas that we like to think that are so antiquated and horrible, when you look back on them now, how often do we engage in those same practices?
That's right. I'm glad you brought up Jim Thorpe, because he had to change his name. Like, Jim Thorpe's not his name. And we have a whole town named after him. Yeah, that is an exact example. And so I don't know if you've ever seen the book by Chris Emdin. It's How to Teach in the, oh gosh, I always forget this title. Teaching in the Hood, How White Folks Can Teach in the Hood, and the rest of y'all too. I know I'm butchering that title. But anyway, he talks about how Jim Thorpe, he uses that exact example in the beginning of how schools take away identity of students, and that we need to be more cognizant and aware of that and more open to the differences. So great segue and connection. Thanks, Sarah. Yep, he was a wrestler. About the dreadlocks, Jason.
That's right. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Erica. I was butchering it. Okay, so self-reflection questions. So we've given quite a bit, but I just want you to think about these in particular. Now, this comes from the National Association of School Psychologists, a handout called Understanding Race and Privilege. So I'm sharing that so that you have some resources for us as school psychs that connect directly to this work. So the first question is, when was the last time you had to think about? So remember, I asked that before, like, what are the identities you think about the most often? That I want you to still kind of sit in that for a while. When were you keenly aware? The next question, I think, is one that can be interesting. How do you respond when others make negative statements towards individuals of a different ethnicity, race, gender, ability, sexual orientation that's different than yourself? So when you hear bias statements, or, if the special ed kids weren't here, how would we handle that? Or, anything that has a negative connotation associated with a group, how do we respond? Do we respond in those moments? I can share that I'm not a confrontational person. So sometimes I'm so caught off guard by a statement that I'm not quick enough to respond. I may come back later and have a conversation. So I'm going to ask you really quick in the chat, on a scale of 1 to 5, 1 being totally uncomfortable, 5 being very comfortable, where would you rate yourself on being able to respond in negative statements? 1 being totally uncomfortable, 5 being very comfortable. Patrice, thank you. Yep, we're getting some 2s, some 3s, some it depends. Yep, depends on the setting, people in the environment. Yep. So I share that because it does really depend. Some of us are this way. Like, I appreciate Patrice saying I'm a 4 and I'm a 4 no matter what. And that's good. That's okay. Some of us are different in the continuum. And so I just want us to acknowledge that, because that is something we may have to practice. We may have to get a little bit more confident in being able to do it. But again, as systems change agents, we have to be willing to take those risks. How do you feel when you're in a community that is different than your neighborhood? Think about that. Again, no need to respond in the chat. These are self-reflection. And if you recognized your privilege, what did you do with this realization? Now, we could spend an entire day on what is privilege, because there are people who are very upset by just that word. And right now, and I'm going to be 100% honest here, the term equity is being weaponized. And when I say that, I mean people are saying equity means a gang. Equity is political. Equity is critical race theory. Equity has no place in our schools. Equity violates my religious rights. I'm sharing things I've heard, not things I'm making up. And part of where that resistance is coming from is this concept of privilege, even talking about bias, that people feel like they're being attacked or provoked. And so what I want us to do as we think about this term privilege is to think about it individually, but also understand that privilege is societal. We all have unearned privileges in our own way. Many of us have degrees. That's a privilege. Many of us live in nice homes. That's a privilege. Many of us are heterosexual and can walk down a street holding hands with our husband or wife and no one takes a second look. That's a privilege. Some of us have different skin color. Remember that melanin? And we can say and do certain things that others of us can't. And the example I'll provide is case in point. There are things that, and Jason knows I love him, but there are things that Jason can say that I can't say. Or if I say it, I get an immediate shutdown, but it's received when Jason shares it. That's privilege. Did Jason earn that privilege? No. Does Jason want that privilege? Probably not. But it's society that allows for that privilege to be. And so when we realize that we have some of those privileges, how do we leverage it to support the people that don't? That's being a systems change agent.
You're
Comment.
much gentler about that than you were the last time.
Say again.
You're much gentler about that with me than you were the last time. But it's a point that needs to be driven home, and I will say that as oh, sorry.
Your lights are on.
Well, it's we're very good about preserving electricity. If I don't move enough, it goes out. No, I hit, if you think about what the majority characteristics are, I hit them. So white, male, cisgender, able-bodied, have degrees.
Mhm.
Let's see. Oh, but the one that you added the last time that wasn't here is that I'm 6 feet tall.
Yes.
And so, if 90, I think it's something crazy like 95% of CEOs of companies are white men who are 6 feet or taller.
Mhm.
So, I mean, you think about all the dominant categories that you can hit, I probably hit on them. And so, yes, and Nicole's absolutely right. I have been in meetings where a colleague will say something, either a female or a colleague of color will say something that is 100% correct. And we'll be kind of, well, I don't know. And I would just simply reiterate, say, no, that's really important. We need to talk about that. And it's like, oh, yes, very good. Yes, really brilliant idea. I'm like, I didn't say anything that the person next to me just said that they didn't just say. I just reiterate. I just said it again. And now it's received because it came from me. That's ludicrous. So that's something. So if you don't believe privilege exists, then you're not paying close enough attention. You need to be looking around and paying attention to the dynamics and the interactions. And I challenge you to watch that, particularly if you look a lot like me. Watch the interactions and see how things are perceived differently. See if you're able to say things that others are not. See if it's received differently. I just had a conversation yesterday. We had our intern supervision, and we were talking about how we had a colleague who'd said something inappropriate, and I challenged them on that. And the other person, one of my other colleagues said, not in this meeting, it was something we're talking about historically that had happened. And my colleague said, yeah, I was in that meeting. If I had said to this person as a woman the same thing that Jason said, there would have been a lot of repercussions for that. A lot of repercussions because of that. So it's, if you don't, again, if you're not paying attention, if you're not, it's there, you have to pay attention to it. As I said the last time we had this presentation, when I walk into a room, and I will say this is definitely prior to having really engaged with and really started working at the equity and social justice path, when I would walk into a room, I would simply walk into a room. I never thought once about how I was perceived, what people were thinking, the environment was. I walked in there. That is my definition of my privilege. I walk down the street. I can walk down the street at night, and I'm really not particularly concerned. I walk in different neighborhoods, not particularly concerned. Why is that? It's the definition of my privilege. There are things that I can do that just that because of that have nothing to do with other than, you know, that genetic roll of the dice that I happen to be. This is the way I turned out. That's it. So it's not anything that I earned in particular. It is simply because of the way I look and am perceived, and that's just the way my world has been. So if you're not looking, you're totally unaware. How many? I will say, how many people who are white on this in this Zoom actually think about being white? Ever? I would be willing to bet, and I would be willing to bet that Nicole thinks about being a Black woman a lot.
All the time.
Yeah, and that's huge. So think about what our students are experiencing, and so that's how you can be an ally and think about this change. Is how do we do this work? Because this is critical. Because if you think that school is the same for everybody, you're fooling yourselves. Your experience, my experience of school, I would be willing to bet cash a paycheck. I would be willing to bet that my experience of K-12 education was radically different than Nicole's for no other reason than because of the way we look. So.
Yep. So Lorraine had a question, said, I hope you're planning to talk about how to begin this conversation without shutting people down. So to that, I think it all depends on, again, someone put in the chat about depending on the audience. And you're right, there is quite the heavy potential of someone shutting down soon as you do begin the conversation of privilege and what Jason just articulated. So what I find is that you have to look for entry points. And oftentimes, those entry points are things like poverty. For whatever reason, people are a little bit more open to having discussions about poverty than they are about race, about gender, about sexual orientation. And so oftentimes that's where I have to begin with certain groups of people, individuals and groups. Once that entry point is there, then it can begin the conversation of the intersections, which Jason highlighted earlier, and the intersections we all have too, which is why we did the social identity wheel. So that would be my recommendation. Find the entry point that most resonates with the person you're talking to or the group that you're connecting to, because you're right, if they shut down, then you've lost everything and you won't be able to gain that trust to have the conversation go into more depth. So that would be my recommendation. Jason, do you have any suggestions there too?
No, I think that's spot on. Is you really have to think about who your audience is and what will resonate with them. I will say that my approach that I did in my own district, and this will again speak to the concept of privilege right now, was to be a little less thoughtful about it than Nicole just suggested. I was a bit more blunt. I basically shared the disproportionality discipline data with our staff at a faculty meeting, and said, this is what it looks like. It certainly jump-started the conversation, but it definitely, there were a lot of negative reactions to that. So in hindsight, perhaps not the most appropriate way to do that or effective way to do that, but it started the conversation. But again, to Nicole's point earlier, I was able to do that because of my privilege. So I think it has allowed that. So I think finding ways to help people have a way to understand and enter this conversation safely is a good idea. We followed up with other faculties at different levels saying, what we're about to share is not just our problem, it's a nationwide problem. So that put it in context for them, so it helped with that. But it's definitely, entry points are the way to go. How do you help people see it?
Yeah, absolutely. And so this kind of, again, segues very nicely. How do you talk about privilege? And I hope that we both have been able to do that in the time that we just spent. Start by discussing how privilege is part of larger society and which groups have privilege, which don't. Stress that privilege is relative to each individual's lived experiences, which is why Jason shared his, I've shared mine. I think this last bullet is critical. Recognize that having privilege does not require feeling guilty. And I think that's where part of that resistance comes from too, is people go, well, I didn't ask to be born this way. Or why do you think I had a silver spoon in my mouth? And that's the guilt kind of coming out, feeling that you're being blamed for all of society's ills. And that's not at all what the purpose of these discussions are. What I will say is it's the awareness that might make you a little uncomfortable. And the discomfort is okay. It's what do you learn through the discomfort that is the big thing. And then determine and offer ways to challenge systems of privilege and oppression in your own life. And so that's the key. That's the action, because we can sit in, woe is me, I'm sad that I have privilege, or I feel guilty. We don't, I personally, as a Black woman, I don't need Jason to say, I feel so guilty, Nicole. I'm so sorry, Nicole. I don't want him to do that. I want him to do what he's doing today, which is being a co-conspirator with me and being able to share comment that lends itself to validate what I'm saying. That's a way of challenging systems and leveraging those systems of privilege in his own life. And I hope to do the same for others, when they're different from me in their lived experiences too.
Actually, Nicole, you brought up something interesting that I hadn't thought of till this moment, which is, I'm going to ask, and nobody has to put anything in the chat, but I want you to reflect is, have you received anything that I have said this morning differently than you received what Nicole said?
Deep question.
White guy, we're both doctors. I'm significantly older than Nicole. So I don't, that might be something that comes, is there something that it makes, oh yeah, well, he said that, so that's really good. So I just challenge you to think about that and just reflect. Are you receiving it differently when it comes from me versus Nicole? I would hope not, but
that's part of the process, right? It's part of unpacking that piece of our backpack that might be influencing how you are hearing me versus Jason, or vice versa. So that's an excellent reflective question. Absolutely. So that then speaks to 4 agreements of a courageous conversation. And I know we have until 11:45, but we have so much content. So I'm going to start moving at a swifter pace because I want you to hear how Jason has been able to do this work in action, because that's where the rubber meets the road. So just very quickly, as you're thinking about someone and I think Lorraine may have alluded to this, how do we begin these conversations, or how do we engage in these conversations? These can be some anchors that you could include in the process. And so I'm going to unpack them very briefly. But number 1 is to stay engaged. We know that shutdown is very real. And so in order to address part of that, part of the agreements would be, I know that this is a lot to take in. It may make you uncomfortable. I'm asking you to push through that and stay engaged with me as we talk this through. Number 2 is to speak your truth authentically. You may not agree with everything Jason and I just said, and you may be sitting there right now saying, I'm done. I want to sign off of this. That's your truth. What can I say? What can Jason say? But that is the only way that we'll grow, because if we had the opportunity to be together in person and someone is feeling that, I would want them to feel safe enough to be able to say that so that we can have a courageous dialogue. If we continue to just kind of skirt around issues or shut down and we're done, nothing changes. As my pastor says, and I'm going to get a little churchy, he says, if nothing changes, nothing changes. And that's the truth. So your truth helps us to make those changes happen. Number 3, experience discomfort. I read something earlier before this session that said sometimes there are people that train on this effort that just want to make people uncomfortable. Like that's their gig. Like, I like to make you uncomfortable, and so we're going to sit in this discomfort and you're going to feel it, and that's all well and good. However, what is the action that then that person can take? Because if they're just sitting in discomfort and not moving and learning through that discomfort, then it's all for naught and we walk away with nothing solved. Number 4 is to expect and accept non-closure. That is relevant. In the time that we have together, as much time as it is, which I'm loving that it's 3 hours, Jason and I said we could spend a day with you, but we know we're not going to solve all the world's problems in the time that we have together. And the same applies with conversations you have one-on-one, when you're in a data team meeting, when you're connecting with other school psychologists. Expect and accept non-closure, knowing that this work is a journey. Okay, what is implicit bias? So we're going to take this approach of data. So if you're looking at your data system, for instance, and one thing that we'll talk about is something called the School-Wide Information System, which is SWIS. That's the example I'm going to use for the purposes of today. If you're not familiar with SWIS, that's okay. We're going to show you other ways to evaluate disproportionality and where bias may exist. Kent McIntosh, who is one of the premier researchers around this topic related to behavior and PBIS, talks about how through data, you can see if there's explicit bias or potentially implicit bias. When there's explicit bias, the pattern of the data would suggest consistent disproportionality across all situations. So if there are Latino students in your building, and as you're looking at your data, you're noticing that the Latino students are always receiving referrals for disrespect consistently, no matter who the teacher is, no matter what setting it is, no matter what time it is. That is a form of potential explicit bias because just that group of students are receiving those outcomes consistently across. The implications for that would be a stronger policy needs to be put in place. We need to be more active in looking at our data and reporting that data accurately. And what's the accountability to suggest that we need to make some change? This is where we often see schools. This is not to say explicit bias doesn't exist in schools with discipline, because it does, but there's fewer opportunities for that to happen. What we often see is implicit bias, and I'm going to talk about what that means in a moment. But in data, what you see as a pattern are peaks and valleys of disproportionality depending on the situation. So let's take that same example. When we said Latino boys are receiving referrals for disrespect across all these situations, implicit bias would say they're only receiving those referrals at 2:30 in class A with teacher A. But across the other situations, we're not seeing that. That's a peak and a valley that demonstrates perhaps there's implicit bias at play in that particular classroom and why. And so the implications might be, how do we adequately define through our discipline procedures what is disrespect? Or on the flip, which PBIS side would say, what is respectful at XY school? Once we apply those definitions, we can go to teacher A and say, is this truly disrespectful based on our major and minors and what we've defined as disrespect? And how do we unpack that for the teacher? And then provide strategies for the teacher on different strategies that might work when he or she is implicitly thinking that things are being said that are disrespectful. So those are ways that we can start to unpack the difference between explicit and implicit bias in the context of data. So I want to give us some grounding language. Bias, prejudice, discrimination. And this again is to help us understand that every one of us have bias. Every one of us, no matter who we are, just like every one of us has a form of privilege in some capacity. So a bias is a preference for or against something. It's typically unreasoned. It's just in our brain. It's usually by patterns of experienced associations. So hit the chat for me. When I say peanut butter, what do you say? Jelly. Thank you, Christine. Yes. An automatic association. Peanut butter jelly. Someone said Reese's. Yes, that's a good response. Yeah, so peanut butter jelly. So that's an automatic association that our brain does. The same can be said with the associations that our brain does with different groups of people, whether we know it or not, because guess what? We watch TV. We've heard our parents talk about different things. We're on social media, and you start to believe the things that you've heard about groups of people. So remember the Mariah Carey example? That young lady, the roommate, probably had no ill intent, but her bias was to associate Africa with tribes. And so that's where she went. I often say too, with bias, we often gravitate towards people that connect to us. So that's a bias implicitly that just comes to be. So I often share, I'm a Millersville grad. If anyone's from Millersville, go MU. You can put it in the chat, go Marauders. If I meet you as a Millersville alum, we could talk about the smack. We could talk about all these different things that happened at Millersville or that were a building or a section of Millersville because we have that built-in connection. Our in group is the same. If I meet someone from, no shade, Jason, from Penn State, and we start talking, I may not know the little things about Penn State that Jason knows. So I'm naturally gravitating towards the people that are in my in group implicitly. That's implicit bias. As we move up, then we have prejudices. Prejudices are strong bias, negative or positive, based on the group membership. So think about that same thing. So now, if I say I don't like Penn State people, now I'm starting to be prejudiced against people that go to Penn State. Discrimination are the actions taken based on that prejudice. So I'm going to give another example that hopefully won't put Jason in a bad place. So hopefully he's not a Cowboys fan, but this is the next example, right? So someone who grew up exposed to loathing the Dallas Cowboys develops a bias against anything associated with them. So you see a blue star and you're done. You don't like it. Someone who's uneasy around Dallas Cowboys fans are prejudiced. Someone who won't hire a Dallas Cowboys fan is practicing discrimination. And if there's Cowboys fans in here, my apologies. But this is an example of how easily bias can manifest itself into the decisions and the actions that we then take. Okay, so Jason highlighted this one about how we have bias and disproportionality in every facet of our life. So less than 15% of American men are over 6 feet tall, yet almost 60% of corporate CEOs are over 6 feet tall. Now that's from 2008. That number may have changed by now, but as we're thinking about that, that's disproportionate. And it's about height. So these are the things that influence what we get into our brain, right? 13% of the US population is Black, yet 40% of those incarcerated are Black. And in a moment, I'm going to show you how that connects to schools. Last one, 3% of advertising creative directors are women, yet over 50% of the American population are female. Highly disproportionate. And who do people advertise typically for? For women. But who's making the decisions? Men, on what it is women want. So that just speaks to, again, a disproportionate outcome that, intended or not, is a part of our society. Keep that second one in mind as I go to this next slide. Well, actually, no, it doesn't even. Yes, here we go. Black students made up 13.6% of Pennsylvania students, but almost half received OSS, out of school suspension. Does that look familiar? What did it say about prison? 13 and 40, right? 13 and 48. That is the demonstration of the school to prison pipeline. So when people say that, and some of us go, oh, that's not a real thing. Oh, but it is. And preschool to prison pipeline, infant to prison pipeline is a real thing too. So I've heard, there are preschools that are suspending students as young as 2 for misbehavior. And they're missing instruction already. And it's perpetuating this thought that I don't belong, that I'm othered, that my behavior doesn't fit the norm. And we end up with disproportionality like that. Students with disabilities are almost twice as likely as non-disabled students to receive out-of-school suspension, 11% to about 5%. So if you intersect those two things, Black students with disabilities, that number is probably a little bit higher, but it goes to show when students are othered, whether that's with a disability, whether that's based on color, whether that's based on gender, we're seeing disproportionate outcomes with behavior. And Pennsylvania is one of 11 states where the difference in suspension rates between Black and white students, a suspension gap, is higher than the national average for both male and female. And I think it's important to highlight here female. For a lot of this data, there's a focus on Black boys, but Black girls are starting to see a tremendous uptick in the amount of referrals and suspensions and expulsions as well. I want to highlight this. This is from 2016. So this is a map of the country. And as we look over on the right-hand side, the legend indicates by color the relative risk ratios by county. So this was a study done by Princeton. And if you hover over this interactive map, you can go by county. Now remember, Pennsylvania is not a county-based district system. So we have 500 plus school districts, and within our counties, we have multiple districts that exist. But this particular study highlights by county. So anything yellow indicates that basically, and I'm going to use this example because that's what the article says, Black students are this many times more likely to receive and fill in the blank, suspension, expulsion, restraint. It allows you to select those outcomes, whether it is suspension or expulsion. So the one that I did is based on suspension. What I found is that Pennsylvania is quote unquote leading the way. And what I mean by that is not a positive. We're highly yellow. So what does that mean? It means that anything above 1 is overrepresentation. And so when I hover over my county, which is about right there, Dauphin County, it says that Black students are 7.5 times more likely to be suspended than their white peers. So what does that all mean? Because we hear numbers like this all the time. So I'm going to get a bit personal when I say this. This means to me, as a Black mom of a Black 3-year-old boy who I adore, that when he turns 5 and is going to enter into kindergarten, that he'll walk into the door of his elementary school at kindergarten with perhaps a best friend who happens to be a white male. They'll walk in the door together. And my son, because he's a Black boy, will be already 7.5 times more likely to receive a suspension than his best friend that walks in the door at the same exact time. And I pause because every time I share that, and I share it a lot, because I don't want my child to lose his spirit. And every time he does something new and he's excited about it, I worry, how will that be perceived when he goes to school? Will that be punished? Will that require a suspension? Will that start the trajectory for him? And I don't want him to go through that. And I'm sure if you were sitting in my shoes, you wouldn't want your child to go through that. That's why we have to do this work as school psychologists, to be the change agents, because it doesn't have to be that way. And I'll say that and I'll stop and see if Jason has anything to say at all.
It chokes me up just to hear it, frankly. But it is our responsibility and our obligation and our duty to counteract that trend. Mm-hmm. It is pervasive. It is constant, and if we don't change it, it won't change. To quote, to paraphrase your minister, that's huge. And if for those who don't think that this is real, I mean, I think that example alone should drive the point home for everybody. Is that, whether you have a child or not,
right?
That is a huge experience for every parent. I mean, when a child walks into kindergarten anyway, that's a huge leap of faith by all of our parents, don't you think? They're dropping off their 5-year-old with you to take care of them for 7 hours of a day. And you're going to spend more time with them at that point than their families sometimes. Wow, what a huge responsibility. And to know that that's a potential problem right out of the gate, that's something we need to be, if nothing else, this that is said today makes you change your mind or think you need to be doing something different or reflect on how practices are going and feel mobilized to want to change this, that should do it for you. That should do it for you.
Jason, I remember in another, because we do sessions all the time, but I remember a session we did, and you said something that resonated with me and even made me think deeper about this too, about how we have to understand that not every educator is going to like our child.
Mhm.
And for whatever reason, that has resonated with me. And so if there are educators in the building that don't like my child, please try to be that one educator that does. That's what I would ask you to do.
Yeah. And honestly, the context for that was, I said, when my daughter, who's now in college, when she started kindergarten, one of the things that we were most focused on was wanting her to love her teachers and her teachers to love her, even if it wasn't true to her. That's how she felt it was, because that would be a huge difference in her ability. Think about it. If your kids really love what they're and feel like their teachers love them, then they do better because they want to do it. They're excited to do it. They're engaged. And the question was, do those teachers like them? Do they like them? That's huge.
It's
Your kid may
huge.
love their teacher. Does their teacher love them?
Mhm. And this isn't to bash teachers, it's just calling it out to say that there are some educators who struggle with kids, and in those struggles don't like them after dealing with them. And so that's a reality that we have to just be very cognizant of when we're trying to have these conversations about data, about why there's disproportionality. We have to personalize it in some ways to make it relevant for folks.
And I'll share an example from this district, and it was a few years ago, and this just will speak to the bias and issues that exist. And so, is we had a student who, middle school student, young Black man, 6th grade. He was struggling. He wasn't academically. He was great. Behaviorally, he was legitimately struggling, and it was really difficult for him, and had a lot of issues that were, and so we worked with him and ended up and somebody put it, I think Janice put in the chat about certain special education categories, and we'll
Mhm.
talk about that a little bit later. But we ended up being identified as being a student with an emotional disturbance and started receiving that programming. And 3 weeks later, and he really, and the moral of the story is he really responded great. He's doing wonderful. He's selling now, which is great. So it was really hit him at the right moment and really got supports in place for him. 3 weeks after he had started his receiving special education services, another student moved in to 6th grade, and was about the same height, about the same weight, build, body shape, everything as the student we'd identified, and also was Black. And I am served 2 different buildings, and I walked into the building back into the middle school and was walking down the 6th grade hallway, and a teacher immediately right up to me and said, "We have the student, you need to evaluate him for special education." And I'm like, I'm sorry, who? And they said the name. I said, name doesn't ring a bell. And they're like, oh, they're brand new. They just started. This is their first day. Like, I said, so why does this child need to be identified for special education? And they said, well, he looks just like, literally they said, he looks just like blah, blah, blah. He's just like him. So he needs to go to special, he needs to evaluate him for special education. My response was no. I said, no, we're not having that conversation. We're going to give the student more than 2.5 hours of a shock before we decide that he needs to be evaluated for special education and place in an emotional support classroom and receive those types of services. So I'm going to say no. And I would also encourage you to think about what you should be doing differently with the student. He's been here 2 hours. Perhaps that he does not feel comfortable in this school. Perhaps
Right.
we should focus on trying to make him feel welcome and really try to help him engage and feel good about it, and recognize that he's a middle school boy who might be trying to figure out his place among his peers, and perhaps anything you're seeing behaviorally might actually be a function of really not knowing what the deal is and how we should be behaving in this setting. So I think we're going to say no, and we'll talk later. So I think you should give this child the benefit of the doubt. How about if we start there?
Mhm. Mhm.
So yeah, and literally, I mean, and I was stunned at the fact that they just said right out, looks just like him. Looks just like him. And I'm like, wow, did you? And I actually said, did you not hear what you just said? So again, yeah, it's important to confront those things. And that was a perfect example of it, and one that was stunning to me. And frankly, as the other building I work in is our K-1 building, and it is not atypical on the first day of kindergarten to have teachers drag kids up to me to say they need to be evaluated for special education services. And there happens to be a feature that a lot of these kids have in common. And yeah, I'm sure you can guess what that feature is. Melanin is what the feature is. So
It's a reality. Yeah.
and they will say, I'm doing this to help them.
Yep.
I want to help.
Someone put that in the chat about the fix. It's the fix. Trying to fix them, trying to make it quote unquote better for them. And that we got to get away from that mentality that special education just fixes kids. We got to give them a chance to be a student.
Who knew?
Right.
Who knew? Right. And honestly, I mean, you have data at your fingertips. You have, if you're doing MTSS, wonderful. You need to use it. I just did a session the other day called "The Data Doesn't Lie, Do We?"
Yep.
And the question is do you use your data effectively? And we'll talk about this later, but there's power in that, and to use that to its greatest effect. So
it's true. And so I'm excited for you to highlight some of the ways that you've been able to access, because that's the other word. How do we get school psychologists to get access to this data, to even know? I mean, we can anecdotally start to put some puzzle pieces together, but to actually be able to dive in and be able to share that data is critical. So stay tuned, folks, because Jason is going to take you through that. And I'm going to start to wrap up soon. So the impact of uninterrupted bias, we've said this, you've heard us now kind of give examples of what happens when bias is not addressed. We want to highlight, though, that as individuals, as educators, we want to empower others to be aware of their biases, to be concerned about the consequences of those biases. And someone put in the chat, and I actually was like, you are so right. Some people don't see equity as valuable. And in that, they're saying, I don't want to lose my privilege and my status by giving it to someone else or leveraging part of it to someone else. And that is a piece of being concerned about the consequences. Know when biased responses are most likely to occur. That's your data dive. And have replacement behaviors to respond. And so I'm going to talk about what that looks like in a minute. Not going to spend a ton of time here. I'm just going to ask you to put in the chat, where do you see implicit bias impacting decisions to discipline students? We've given you some great examples, but where do you see it happening around discipline? What are some of those behaviors that students are being referred for? Yep, disrespect. Thanks, Danielle. What are some others? Insubordination. Oh my goodness, yes. Truancy, non-compliance, wearing a hood, aggression, referral of disrespect due to lack of eye contact.
Defiance is why I saw that float by. That's one that I hear a lot.
Dress code. Yep, you're right. These are bias in nature. Not talking. Poor work ethic. Wow, who determines that? Subjective. Loud, aggressive. Lack of participation, quote unquote motivation. Running in the hallway. Family reputation as difficult. Yes, Steph. Yes, we're going to talk about that. Remember those perspectives of families and how that can influence what we do? Yes. Okay, that brings me to vulnerable decision points. One of the tools that I want you to think about is this concept of a ladder of inference. So when we have a ladder of inference, I want you to picture having this ladder inside your brain. Every one of us has these. So this is how we get to some of our quick decisions. Remember, we said biased decisions are often quick associations that we make and we just act. Here's an example. At the bottom rung of the ladder, which is when you're taking in the information, picture your brain as a video camera. The experience is that the student you see in front of you has their head on the desk. So follow me up the ladder. Number 2, the data we apply to that is that the student must be sleeping. The meaning we then attach is that students who want to learn stay awake in my room. Sound familiar? We can all probably relate in some way. Number 4, then I form an assumption. This student's not energetic about learning. I then draw a conclusion based on the meaning I put in. The student doesn't want to learn. Then my beliefs kick in because of past experience or what I deem appropriate. Student and anyone associated doesn't want to learn. And my action now is to actively work to remove that student, because my ladder in totality is saying disrespect. That's what it's kind of sharing or shouting as we're going through it. When you're asleep in my class, you're not listening to me, and therefore I feel disrespected and I want you gone. I've moved up the ladder quickly. This example, which comes out of the work, and I forget his name, but there's a video called Rethinking Thinking. If you simply go to YouTube and type in Rethinking Thinking, there's a short clip, about 4 minutes, on the ladder of inference. And they use an example of a parking lot and a parking space and a whole hot mess of road rage. But nonetheless, it talks about how moving up that ladder of inference can make you do things irrationally. And so the goal is to interrupt the ladder. And what I mean by that is when we get to like 3 and 4, what could we do differently? What could be the replacement behavior that might change how we then move up the rungs? So at number 4, when I'm starting to get upset, this student's not energetic. If I go and tap the student on the shoulder and say, hey, what's going on? You're asleep. That's not like you. Student says, I was up all night. I had to watch my sibling. My mom works a night shift. Da 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 da. This is an ideal example. It doesn't always work so nicely. But in this example, the interruption is that I've now asked the student what's going on. My anxiety or my anger starts to lessen, and my action is now going to be different. Rather than seeking to remove the student, I'm now going to do something different to ensure that I'm supporting the student in that case. So that is one tool that, as we think about bias and how easily it can impact us, the ladder of inference is a way of approaching this that we can explain to other educators of what may be their process of thinking. Okay, so what are vulnerable decision points? We saw how they can easily happen on the ladder of inference. So if there's a bias that already exists, we then apply that bias to the situation, we end up with disproportionate discipline. And you might say, Nicole, what are vulnerable decision points? Okay, here are some to consider. We've mentioned this. Subjective behavior is a vulnerable decision point. A vague discipline system. So in one class, you can say an F-bomb. In another class, you can't. Vague discipline system, lack of consistency. Prior incidents. So remember, I think Steph put it in the chat, having a reputation, like a family having a reputation, prior incidents with that family can lead to vulnerable decision points, meaning I automatically associate, I automatically do these things that contribute to my bias and contribute to disproportionality. Now, when you think about on the other side, these are things that are more physical in nature. Hunger. So we've seen the Snickers commercials. Eat a Snickers and feel better because you have an attitude right now when you're hangry. So when people are hungry, they're typically less tolerant. And that's also a vulnerable decision point. So when you couple things like hunger plus prior incidents or plus anything else, the likelihood of you making disproportionate decisions goes up. Same thing with being tired. When you're fatigued, it also contributes to all of these outcomes. And then unfamiliarity with the student. So you're in the hallway, you're monitoring the hall, the student comes down like someone put running in the hallway. You don't know the student, but you address them and they go, I don't know you, why are you talking to me? And your immediate response, because you don't know them, is you don't disrespect me, get to the office. These are the ways that we can see disproportionate discipline happen. So when we start understanding what are our VDPs, our vulnerable decision points, what could be our neutralizing routines? What are the things that we could do differently? So for staff, when you see a problem behavior, stop and ask yourself, is this a VDP? So am I hungry? Is it after 11:30? Should I have eaten? Because I'm really just not feeling it today. You threw a pencil, get out. Like that. That's how a VDP can manifest. So we have to evaluate the situation. We have to think about our decision state, which speaks to that physical piece. And then if I do recognize I'm in the midst of a VDP, what's my agreed upon alternative response? Remember, we talked about replacement behavior. So what I would say to us as school psychologists is this has a very individual kind of approach, but as you're coaching teams or you're supporting teams, whether that's MTSS, PBIS, grade levels, departments can actually come up with agreed alternative responses as well. So I don't want us to neglect that fact that we can be systems level, right? When we think about imparting some of these skills, not only for individual staff members, but collectively for that consistency build. So this is what happens. Neutralizing routines reduce effects for implicit bias. So before we do the animation, I know it did it already, we have the setting event. So I have a lack of positive interactions with the student and I'm tired. Remember, coupled together. The antecedent, the student complains loudly about work. I hate this class. Why are we studying XY? A subjective behavior. I'm hungry and I'm tired and I don't really know this student. I'm sending them to the office. So that takes us to B, the behavior. The consequence is the student leaves the class and then they escape social interaction. They're having a good time and I'm still sitting there mad, hungry and tired. So nothing has really been solved. But if I can do a self-assessment midway that says, am I in the midst of a VDP? Now, granted, not always easy, so this takes practice because we don't always recognize we're in the midst of one. If we can do that, though, my alternative response could be, see me after class, rather than going and writing up the ODR right at that moment, sending the student out right at that moment. We've now prevented that and hopefully prevented a suspension or an expulsion or just an escalated behavior that didn't have to be. Okay, so what makes for a good neutralizing routine? Number one, they should be brief. Don't create a neutralizing routine that has 5 steps that you then have to always remember. It could be counting to 10. It could be taking a deep breath. It could be calling a colleague over to take the class for a minute. It could be whatever you need it to be. If-then statements. If student A does this and I know it's a trigger for me, then I'm going to do fill in the blank. Count to 10, fill in the blank. They should be clear and they should be doable. So here are some just examples. Not to say this is an exhaustive list, but you could delay, as we saw in the example, see me after class. You could pause, take a deep breath, pause before you make a reaction. You could use a least exclusionary choice. So instead of writing the ODR at that moment, you could delay it. You may be able to have a conversation that allows you to say, you know what, I'm not going to write you up, but I do want you to know I'm not going to tolerate this in my class, whatever you say. But we don't always have to go to that extreme. And then ask, state your confidence in them, and then discuss privately. So remember Jason said way back when we talked about engagement, we need to ask students what they're thinking or how they like school or don't like school. This is one of those things. So remember I said in the ladder, we could tap them on the shoulder. Hey, what's going on? They start talking to us. But the key thing there that I want you to always keep in mind, privacy is so critical. I joke when I share this that my mom, when I was younger, would say, if you embarrass me in public, I'm going to embarrass you in public. And the truth is there, because if you embarrass a student in front of peers as they perceive it as embarrassment, the likelihood of the escalation is much higher, because now I have to prove to everyone that I'm in charge, that I have control, and then it becomes a power struggle. So really, really critical to think about those as alternative responses. I'm moving quick, so forgive me, but the neutralizing routine examples, again, could be, if this is a VDP, am I acting in line with my values? Because oftentimes, implicit bias doesn't align to our moral values or the values that we put forth. So we have to think about that. Am I doing what I say I mean, or that I mean to be when I'm engaging with students? If defiance, can I keep it in class? Do I really need the principal? Can I handle this on my own? Am I giving my power away when I send the student out? If I'm tired, can I delay the decision until I can think clearly?
It's actually cool. I
Go
know
ahead.
that their way of framing the VDPs was it was SOS,
Mm-hmm.
which was stop, observe, and support. And the
Beautiful.
stop was to stop, and before you said anything, check in with yourself in the situation, observe what's going on, and then figure out how to support the situation to make it better. So I thought that's
Absolutely.
a way of reframing sort of that sort of neutralizing routine, which is, okay, if I just stop and look around and say, what do I need to do that's actually supportive, that was a different lens to look through.
Yeah, I love that. It's a great idea. I know many of us may or may not be administrators on the call. However, what I showcased before was more for teacher level, educator level, student level. When you're an admin, remember we talked about managing the dynamics of difference, how you have to kind of be in a neutral space. When you have to handle a problem behavior, stop and tell yourself, don't just do something, stand there. Reason being, you don't want to make an irrational decision coupled with another irrational decision that might have been made by the adult or the student. So it's important to stand there and absorb what is being shared with you. Be sure to get ready to act in line with your own values, getting information from the student and staff. And I love this last one, assess the student teacher relationship. Just like Jason shared in his example with the teacher who came up and said, oh, this student looks like so and so. He already knew. He knows his people. He knows his teachers. We know our staff members and our colleagues. So that allows us to be able to have an outside lens to say, yeah, but you probably said X, Y. In your head, you're saying that. And that's the way that you can think about how to best address that situation. So that assessment is critical, not just taking one side of the story. This next piece is really critical too. Whenever possible, whatever your agreed upon response should be instructional in nature. Discipline means to teach. It doesn't mean to punish. So when we're disciplining a student or we're disciplining a staff member, I hate to put it that way, we need to teach the missing skill because something is missing. So what can we do to ensure that those folks, whoever they are, they're able to then gain the skill that they're lacking, and then connecting the student to school and staff, because there's probably a disconnect somewhere where they're not feeling that sense of belonging that we defined earlier. Okay, so in summary, with VDPs, just know that these are specific decisions that are at risk of implicit bias, and that reducing implicit bias suggests a need to clarify discipline procedures and provide strategies for decision making. Neutralizing routines are the opposite of a response that's a snap decision, and that in-depth data review provides the information needed to identify VDPs. And tracking the use of these neutralizing routines is important. So just because we think, oh, I'm good counting to 10, but you're not seeing that that's actually working, just like if we're doing interventions for students, if we're not making progress, we need to change that intervention, right? Or think about a different approach. We need to evaluate if our neutralizing routines are actually working for us. And if not, what can we do differently? Okay, it is 10:38. I'm thinking if we could take, and I'm going to look to Erica for this because she's the Act 48 police, but could we take like a 5-minute break so that Jason and I can get through our content? Do you think that's okay? Is Erica on?
She said, sure.
She says sure. Okay, so it's 10:38. Let's come back around. Let's just say 10:45. Let's just make it an easy 10:45, and then we'll knock out the rest of the session. Sound good? All right, we'll see you back. Isn't of time. Thank you so much for sticking with us for the time so far. From what we're seeing in the chat, a lot of engagement is happening, and so that's really important to Jason and I, that we're resonating with you, that things are making sense, and that hopefully it's applicable to the roles that you hold as school psychologists. So as we transition into the next section, what we're going to highlight now is the importance of data and how our role in particular is imperative to engaging with data through an equitable lens. And I'm actually sad that I didn't change this slide because I've changed my terminology recently. I heard Kent McIntosh speak, and one of the things that he said is that oftentimes with using the word lens, that implies that you can take the lens on and off. And what we're really trying to get to is mindset. So if I had to read this differently, it would say evaluating data with an equitable mindset. So I would encourage you to think about that as well.
Well, that's an excellent point, because this is not this is how we should be doing business. This should just be part of what you do, and not something that's an add-on. And I think that you see that a lot. Somebody mentioned earlier in the chat about impact on teacher training, school psych training, undergrad training, et cetera. And I think that oftentimes historically what you've seen in terms of coursework is that there was a course that was maybe called individual differences, or maybe they called it cultural competence or something like that, that was kind of like an add-on, like it was like jammed on. It didn't feel like it was organic to like training you. It just felt like, well, we're going to put this in because it's an obligation and we have to fill that box, as opposed to being integrated into all of your classes. So I know from NASC, being on the social justice work group there, is that what we've taken pains to say is that all the strategic goals, for example, for the organization, working on shortages, leadership development, um, mental health and behavioral health provision, et cetera, all of those, it's not social justice and equity just are not separate from them. They're embedded in all of those. So it's a part of all of that work. So it's not something that is different and you do kind of over here. It's part of what we do. So as we're thinking about looking at our data, that's a huge piece of it, is that we have to be, this has to be part of how we organically work with our data and evaluate our data. Because obviously the purpose of schools is, we're trying to have all students achieve at high levels. That's our goal. We want to raise all the boats. And so really looking at it through the graphic there about equity and equality, I'm not going to spend a lot of time with that, but I want to spend a little time talking about the cultural participation and the upward and downward spiral conversations there. Because in order to have those conversations, and we will discuss that, and I'm hovering my mouse and you can't see it because Nicole's driving this train. So it's under the disaggregate the data is what I'm hovering my mouse around. That is a huge that's a huge skill set that we bring, that we're able to do that, and we have to be able to have access to data in order to do that. So that's not a small piece of what we will be able to do is the process. So we'll go to the next slide.
Yeah.
Thank you. I feel very odd having to ask that.
No, please do.
So, right. So then as you're looking at the cultural proficiency continuum, you go from the very top there, which is cultural proficiency, all the way to cultural destructiveness. And what we want to do is we're able to move our conversation up. So we're not looking, if you look at the bottom there, we're not seeking to eliminate the culture of others and aspects. One of the, I think, most harmful things that I hear people say all the time, and they're being helpful, and they're not. They're like, well, I don't see color, or I don't see fill in the blank. I don't see gender. I don't see gender identity. I don't see anything. Whatever it is, really, you don't see that. It's mind blowing to me that people think that that's helpful. And I know that there's been a lot of talk thankfully, over the last year of people saying, "I see you." I've heard that phrase a lot, which I think out of context, people don't necessarily get that, but it's saying, no, I acknowledge, there are differences, and differences aren't problematic. They should be celebrated and valued, and that's okay. But when we try to eliminate that, it creates significant problems. That's cultural destructiveness. That's Jim Thorpe and all of that all over again. We don't want to do that. We want to have the vision that we all are lifelong learners, and we're developing all of that, and we're moving people in the conversations along that way. So if we want to jump to the next slide.
Sure.
Yes. Yeah. I'm very excited to get to this one. So, so when you look at this, so we're talking about different types of conversations, downward or upward spiraling conversations. And I want you to reflect on conversations you've had in data meetings, perhaps when you're meeting with staff about a referral concern, within the context of the IEP process, within the context of the evaluation process, within the context of your MTSS meetings, if you have a pre-referral process, if you're doing that framework. Think about those conversations you've had, or just somebody stopping you in the hallway to express concerns or to talk to you about that. How do these conversations take place? What do they look like? The downward conversation, and Nicole touched on this earlier when she talked about achievement gap versus opportunity gap. Because people always make a big deal, particularly now, about, oh, it's all semantics. You're making a big deal out of nothing because it's the language isn't important. Really? When has language not been important? When has it not communicated that? When have you ever heard somebody say, well, I'm just blank, so they're diminishing themselves. Yeah, that matters. That language does matter. And so that's a huge part of it. So when you look at this conversation, so we start the conversation with, we have a huge gap in math outcomes between groups. And somebody says, yes, the African-American students seem to be far behind the white students, as opposed to saying, um, I'm sorry, I'm getting lost in my slide here for a minute.
Okay.
It's how do we have these conversations when we're moving them up? And they're identifying the problem where, you get to the point where they're saying, these kids just can't cut it in math. There it was. I was looking at the right. I didn't enlarge the slide. Apparently, the glasses are not big enough. Sorry. So you see that they're saying the data seems to suggest that these kids can't cut it in math. How many times have you heard somebody say something like that? They might not have said these kids, or they might say those kids, or something like that, as opposed to saying it more in an objective way, which is, yeah, with you're focusing on something that is different as part of that conversation, which is there may be a gap, but we're seeing that some students have gained and made progress since last year. They're focusing on all that as opposed to making those attributions. And it's one of those things where within the context of those conversations, it's where people bring in their biases and they make these attributions and they make these global blanket statements about students or groups of students and why they are not achieving. And they make those statements as if they're absolutes. The comment of these kids is a problem in terms of that, because that conversation then spirals out of control because you get the idea that they just don't care. They come from the trailer park. How many of you sat in a data meeting or any kind of meeting with somebody where they said, Johnny, yeah, he can't do this work because you know how his parents are, or he comes from, and my favorite new code words are, they come from an environment that's not enriched, which is code for either A, poverty, or sometimes just blanketly for non-whites.
Right.
That there are attributions that are made that if you somehow come from a family that is white, that you're automatically enriched in that environment. So those are the things that sort of come in. So there, you really look at those conversations and think about that. I mean, how many of you have had those experiences where that's what works its way into the conversation constantly? It's about, well, and then we talked about the family. Somebody mentioned in the chat about family identification. Yeah, how many of you said, well, so-and-so should probably be evaluated for special education because their older sibling is in special education? And apples and trees, or they'll say that about parents. I think, well, the parent received, I'm old enough to have been around long enough where like parents are now kids, the students I had are now parents of kids that are in our schools. And they're saying, well, I had that kid in school and they couldn't do anything. They couldn't learn. So now clearly that's going to be the issue for this child. So we want to make sure that we're focusing our conversations, as school psychologists, on what are the data actually telling us? What can we pull from that? What are they talking about in terms of gains? What is it that actually shows us a true picture of the situation, as opposed to allowing the global, what am I trying to say? The global generalizations just to exist and to persist. And so we want to make sure that we're challenging those as we go in. And I'm seeing lots of comments in there, and I'm trying not to think too closely about trailer park kids or apartment kids.
Apartment kids.
Yeah, the latchkey kids. That was big when I was younger, back in the 80s, and everything was all the latchkey kids were struggling. They couldn't do anything because, yeah. So we want to make sure that we're focusing our conversations on the data. So when we hear these things come up, we have to change that. So the conversations from my lens, one of the things you need to establish are a set of norms within the context of your data meeting, so that way you're following what those are and focusing on those alterable variables. And that's a concept that we drive home a lot when we talk to anybody, the interns that we have, any staff that will listen, teachers, administrators, is what we need to be focusing and emphasizing are alterable variables. Those things that we can change and control. Can you change anything about me as a white man? Can you change me to be non-white? No. So why is it relevant? It isn't. So why is it relevant for children of color? Why is that relevant in terms of their ability to learn or not? I can't change any of those variables. I can only focus on those. If we could advance the next slide, Nicole. And that's
Yep.
obviously, you feel free to chime in because I tend to, so if there's I will not give opportunity to do that. And being mindful of time, I'm actually going to
Skip.
skip this one, if that's
Yep.
okay.
No problem. I'll move quick. I was thinking the same. We're on the same page. Do you want to do this one or move on?
Let's move on. Let's move on
Okay.
to where we
Yep.
start.
And you've already highlighted this. It's
I
just how to address it. Yep. So here you go.
Yes. Okay. So what we want to talk a little bit about is there's a process that you all have hopefully been trained in that should help with this. And if we can just, I know it's animated, so let's
That's
just,
okay.
which is this process should not be unfamiliar, but we sometimes forget to actually apply it to the work that we do. So when you're thinking about the problem identification, analysis, plan development, implementation, and evaluation, you do that for working with kids on an individual basis. That model in thinking applies to system level change, and specifically. So I would challenge you to not view the individual and within the context of doing this process as being a person, but maybe being a building or a district. That is the individual. So the process still applies. So the old standby of going through this process works. We want to understand the nature and the scope of the problem. As I said earlier, here's a little fun fact. Your data, your discipline data is disproportionate. It is. I'm telling you that right now. And I don't even know more than half the people on this call. I don't know what district you're from, but I'm going to share a little secret from you. It's disproportionate. Your job is to find out how disproportionate, where the disproportionality exists. You need to understand the scope and the nature of the problem. It's there. You have to just find out what it is. And if you don't believe me, I'm putting this in the chat, which is from ProPublica. It's a miseducation. It's a really wonderful interactive tool. You can type in your school district and find out what your discipline disproportionality ratios are, your opportunity gap information, all that sort of information is there. So if you don't believe me, it's there. Even if you are a predominantly white school district, I will guarantee you there's some disproportionality that exists in your system. You just have to know what the nature and scope of it is. So, but as school psychologists, is either the second bullet here, I tend to do as much briefer slides, because I talk too much, so I don't put a lot on the slides. So you have to find out what the nature and the scope of it is. You want to say, if you don't have access to that data, you need to get access from it. So who has access to that data in this book? Because I'll be honest with you, if you're using any kind of student information management system, which is on web-based, which I can't imagine there's anybody who isn't, there's a way to find this information within the context of your student information management. Mm-hmm. You just have to find out who has access to it, who has the rights to it, and ask to have rights to it. Because I would be willing to bet that there are a lot of administrators who have the rights and access to it, but don't know the questions to ask, don't know that they should be looking. And it's your job. The analogy I often use to describe the role of the school psychologist, and this will identify me as a geek really fast, is that we are the Spocks to the administrator's Captain Kirks. Is that, they're the one flying the ship, but we're the ones figuring out to solve all the problems and running the data and figuring out the solutions. That's our job, and that's our role and function within that, is to be those problem solvers. So if we can move to the next slide. So, but there's a lot of data that actually is, thank you, Steph, that is publicly available. And so even if you're having trouble initially getting access to data, because the administrators are hemming and hawing or pushing off or not letting you get access to it, there's actually a pretty good place to start that will just give you some information. Somebody had mentioned earlier in the chat box about special ed referrals. So yes, we probably could. If somebody else could do that, I would allow somebody else to do the frontal lobe for this section and take care of that.
I think it may also be in the Padlet too.
Oh, that's true. Probably is. Mm-hmm. Is that your data for special ed referrals already exists. So if we want to go to the next one, it's on the Penn Data website, the link there. So you can find any school district in the Commonwealth, and you can look up to find your special ed data at a glance report. And it goes back to, I'm pretty sure it goes all the way back, I think 2007, 2008 is the earliest you can go, is the furthest back you can go. But you can go back and look at every single year. The reason that's powerful and important is because if people are, you know, and we're talking about entry points. Your entry point to have this conversation about discipline might not initially be strictly about discipline,
Mhm.
because that might, people, strangely enough, and I'm sure you've experienced this, is that people have very personal and strangely and strongly held beliefs about discipline practices that have nothing to do with reason or research or logic or reality. You could say, hey, we need to teach reading in a more systematic way using phonics instruction, phonological awareness instruction, and doing a systematic using direct instruction practices. And people might initially balk at that if they were like whole language people to begin with, but they might buy it, they'll eventually see the reason and buy into it. It's a lot harder with discipline. People have a really hard time to do that because it's very personal to them. They think about how they were raised. They think about how they were disciplined in school, what they experienced. And that's the lens through which they view all of this. So it might be a little bit hard to get people to buy in initially. So there's a different entry point. I think that, you know, one thing that resonates, no administrator wants to look bad, let's be honest. So your special ed data might be a good entry point for you to start having this conversation. So if you drill down to your school district, and if we can go on to the next slide, that would be great. And that shows you the years you can go. We can move on to the next one, if you wouldn't mind, Nicole. Thank you. This is our special education data for Dairy Township School District from the 2018-19 school year. And if you look at the columns, and you can see there's a column there that has your LEA at the top there in that first box, and then the state. So it gives you your total population enrollment and students. And then by disability category, it goes by and indicates the percentage of your population represented in each one of those. So you can get a sense of that. So you can see whether you're different in terms of your rates of identification of particular disability categories based on relative to the state averages. So if you look though at the box below that, which is the race and ethnicity category for representation in special education versus your school, your LEA, your district, there's a lot of good and powerful information in there to start having the conversation about disproportionality. So for example, if you look at Dairy Township School District there, the 2018-19 school year, one of the things you might note is, one of the things we didn't talk about also, we talked about overrepresentation. We didn't talk about underrepresentation at all very much. So if you look at this, the underrepresentation here for our school district is in the context of special education is among students who are Asian. There's about a third of you would expect, and obviously nothing's 100% perfect, but when you're talking about representation and disproportionality, you would expect to be the rate of representation in special ed to be about the same as the rate of representation in your typical population. There's obviously be slight, little bit, maybe a little up, a little bit down, but you would expect it to be pretty close, right? You wouldn't expect it to be 2 to 3 times different in one direction or the other. You'd expect them to be relatively close in terms of the representation. Otherwise, there's a problem in terms of your processes. So if you look at that, we under-identify likely students who are Asian. And then if you look at the next line, you see Black or African-American students. The representation in our school district is 4.8% of the population, and the representation in special education is 9.1. Let that marinate for a moment. 9.1 and 4.8. Look at Latino, Hispanic Latino. 15.3% in special education, but only represent 8.4% of our student body population. And then look at white. Slight underrepresentation. So if you're wanting to have a point that you can start having this conversation, this is data you personally can access at any point. So if people are saying doesn't exist, not us, that's other people's problems. Wasn't that a song? Anyway, other people's problems. It's not. You can see what your issues are. And to the point that somebody mentioned in the chat really, really early on about those are decisions we make. Well, yeah, we're part of that team. And here's the question / challenge for you. Where does the problem begin? Does the problem begin at the evaluation? I would argue no. Does the problem begin in the referral process? Possibly, but I would argue no. I would argue that the problem begins within the context of the classroom with the instruction and what's going on there, and then works its way to that process. So it might be to the point of, and this is not excusing and saying that as school psychs that we're blameless and guiltless in all this process. And as you can see, that's our data. I'm part of that process, is that if you get 50 referrals that come through your process, you get 50 referrals sort of coming to you, and 45 out of those 50 referrals are Black kids. Even if you only identify a small percentage of that population that you got referrals for, it's still going to be bringing up and making that disproportionate. So it's a whole, I hesitate to use the word food chain, but I can't think of a better analogy right now, but it is a whole stream of situations that come to that point. Another example I'll give in terms of opportunity gaps. One of the questions that has come up is students of colors participating in higher level math classes. And in our district, there's a couple of assessments that are given in sixth grade to determine readiness for algebra and whether that's appropriate for you not to take in seventh grade. And so the sixth grade teachers were feeling the pressure because there's disproportionality there. The students of color are underrepresented in the higher level math classes. And the sixth grade teachers are feeling, oh my God, this is something I did. No, they're the end of the line. They're where the problem appears. It's not their problem to fix or change necessarily. The issue with students not being able to participate in higher level math didn't start in seventh grade, didn't start in sixth grade. It started in kindergarten. So all along that process, that's where that happens. You have to take a longer view and recognize the patterns that in your data. The patterns in your data are not where it shows up is the symptom. The disease is much earlier and much more pronounced. So that's where you need to be addressing that. If we go to the next slide. So this is where I simply underline. I think this is where I put in the highlight and underline what I put, which makes it a lot easier for you to see. So there you can see it much more clearly and easily, the issues with our disproportionality. So as I said, there's some of the issues in terms of your special ed referrals. You got to think about the system and the stream. Where are they coming from? Where are the referral sources? Are they from your parents? Are they from the teachers? Are they from a team? Some things that people look in, and I put in this first one under variables to consider is move-ins. And I put that in for two reasons. One, you need to know that. That's helpful to know. Did you have students who moved in already with IEPs in special education? But also, people like to use that as excuses. Oh, see, well, the reason our numbers don't look good is because all these kids moved in with IEPs. It's not an us thing. They came from somewhere else. Somebody else dropped the ball. We're the ones cleaning up the mess. What I would say, sorry, lights are going out again. Oh, geez. Is that we can't, I know, very absurd. I apologize, everybody. We can't be afraid to examine the data. If the data tells us the problem is us, the problem is us. The fault, dear Brutus, does not lie in the stars. It lies with us. And so that's what we have to be okay and examine. We have to look at that. It's important to really examine that and say, is it, yeah, you might have a percentage of your population that you inherited that moved in from somewhere else, but how much of it is homegrown? How much of it is your system not working? So those are things you need to look at. SES, we talked about some of the intersectionality. How many of these students are students of poverty? Is that what's going on? Is that part of what's contributing to the problem? Is there an intersection there? And then how are these students coded in your system? When I first started pulling all of this data years ago, all I'll say is that things get coded wildly different. And that is a huge issue in terms of whether it's how people identify or how people who are doing the enrollment process choose to identify them. So you really got to think about that. There are lots of issues in that regard, and this is where you have to be very conscious of your if you're using an MTSS process to really use that to its greatest effect for anything, for behavior or for academics, is really being mindful of that and how things are working. Because if a student's name ends with a vowel or a Z, for example, Are they more likely to be considered problematic? How many of you have had this experience? So I didn't even touch on second language issues here, but how many of you have the issue where a student's last name is Rodriguez or Perez or Gutierrez, and people automatically assume that they must have a second language in the home. They're clearly second language learners. They're ELs. So there's some talk about automatic biases. So if we want to jump to the next one. Thank you. So this is just some data we pulled years ago, looking at the referral process and where the referrals were coming from, and what the rates of referrals are, and what were team referrals versus parent referrals, and the overall likelihood they ended up being moving through the process. Now, the reason I shared this slide is because I want to point out some of the sample size. So if you look at some of the sample size, they're relatively small. So on that second column, Black students, parent referred, there was 1 student. And then there were 2 referred by teams. And then for Hispanic Latino, it was 4, and then 8. But there were 17 white, et cetera. So the reason I bring that up is because one of the things you'll hear people say, whether it's academic or behavioral referrals, depending on your district and the makeup of your district, is you will hear people say, well, it doesn't really impact that many kids. You're only talking about what? We had 5 parent referrals, 15 referrals out of the 69 referrals were of Black or Latino students. And if you actually take into account multiracial, you're looking at 19 out of 69. So see, well, that's not a big problem. We're not really having an issue. But what is the representation and what's the rate of referral relative to the representation of the population? That's where the issue comes in. So even if it's a small number of students that are impacted, if the pattern exists, the pattern exists. Let me say that again. If the pattern exists, it exists. So it's not a fluke, and it doesn't matter whether it impacts 1 student or 50 students or 150 students. If the pattern exists, that's the problem you need to be addressing, because that's the disease in your system. Now, where I live, there are a lot of trees behind my home. And you can see when the trees start to die. You see the leaves start to get brown earlier, some of the upper branches start to go. Is that a limb problem? Is that a leaf problem? No, the disease is in the tree, it's in the roots, and it goes all the way up, and that's why it affects that. That's the problem we need to be addressing. We need to be addressing the root of the problem. No pun. Well, yeah, the pun is completely intended, I guess, in that particular example. But that's where we have to be focused on we have to be unafraid to examine our data and look at what it's telling us and be okay with that information and figure out what our next plan is. So if you wouldn't mind advancing the slide, Nicole. So this is just more information on the rates of referrals relative to move-ins. So you can see that, but the pattern still exists. So we're going to scroll down to the eligibility categories. I'm going to dive into looking at the clock. I'm going to skip ahead perhaps to, yeah, there you go. This was one that I definitely encourage you to do, and somebody mentioned this earlier. I'm going to skip ahead to some of the behavioral stuff in a moment, but I wanted to point this out, is that it's really important to look at the categories that students are being referred to and see whether there's a pattern there. Because again, if the pattern exists, it exists. Do you end up identifying students of color disproportionately for emotional disturbances, or OHI? Where OHA becomes your catch-all for kids who can't quite say ED, but they're kind of a pain in your butt. So you're going to say it's ADHD related or some behavioral related, that you're calling it a health impairment. So those are things to be looking at. What are the patterns showing you in that data? And then similarly, as in the next one, we talk about socioeconomic status. And what does that look like based on referrals, and what's the intersectionality there? And then the biggest, I apologize, we're about to dismiss here, so. Can you tell I'm actually in a school, in an elementary school?
Yep.
So this is our version of hybrid. So if you look at this, we want to be able to, that'll just happen intermittently, so I'll mute when it does. Is that that's something to be examined as well. And usually your free and reduced lunch count is where you're going to find that. What I will say about that is that districts tend to guard that information pretty closely and don't want to release that. So you have to really demonstrate your worth and ability to keep that information confidential to be able to access it, because it's a critical part of the analyses as well that you don't want to lose. So scrolling down a little bit, you can see that there's a lot of intersectionality here between special education referrals, students of color, low SES, and the same pattern bears out for discipline referrals, which we're going to get to in a moment. And actually, let's just jump ahead to that. I mentioned the coding concerns. So let's keep going till we get to office discipline referral, which is, I think, a couple of more down. Perfect, right there. All right, so talking about office discipline data. So how is your discipline data captured? That's what you need to know. You need to know, is it being captured within this context of your student information management system? Is it being captured on, there was a while people were still using the old triplicates where they're writing something, submitting to the office, and somebody else codes that in. You need to figure out how that data is being documented, and is it being consistently documented? Because that's a pattern, and that's a problem as well. Who has access to the data? If you don't have access to the data, you need to get access to the data. You ask your principal, ask your central office administrators, ask whomever you need to, and be a pain in the neck, and just keep bugging them until they give you access to it. Because what you want to share with them is like, oh, I want to do some analyses to figure out how we can help you so we can be the best possible district we can be. How can I help you actualize your vision? That's a good one to use with administrators. So, and really, it's really about helping them do that. What variables are attached to those ODRs? Depending on your student information management system, I know with ours, when we first started looking at this data, I had to work with one of our IT folks to get all of the information I wanted actually be able to be run within the context of a report. So it's not just office system referral, it was the referral, the type of referral, the date of the referral, the time of the referral, the consequence that resulted, race, ethnicity, gender, special education status, free and reduced lunch status. I feel like I'm forgetting, but I basically asked for about a dozen variables to have this person. So they worked with them until we got the report right. So now it's just one click and the report will download. So you want to make sure you have all those relevant variables attached to it. And then have you actually, then once you get that data, you want to be able to analyze. You want to look at what are called risk ratios, but you need to get the data. So I don't know how many of you are feeling great and good about your Excel skills. If you're not feeling great and good, it's a great opportunity to figure out how to become better at Excel. Maybe some of your student information management systems will do some of this reporting for you. Some won't. I know ours didn't. So then I basically had to download it into Excel and do the analyses myself. So looking at the next slide. Yeah, get the data. Yeah, that's my takeaway. If you heard nothing else today from me, make sure you get your hands on the data. This is a horrible looking Excel sheet. I apologize in advance. It is very tiny. I'm going to look at you're going to see things and I'm going to break it down for you a bit. But what you're looking at here is what's hidden under that giant orange square as all of the personally identifying information for the students. And what you'll see is all these columns that I was able to set up where we're looking at. So it's able to analyze and sort the data by type and location, race, ethnicity by grade, race, ethnicity by gender. So I was able to do all the intersectionality, looking at all that data, so that way we could get a handle on you can get a handle on the total picture of what's going on with your behavior data. Do the patterns exist? What's going on? How many and then one of the things that we did, so I took this information and shared it with our staff, and I'll get to that in a second, but one of the questions that always comes up is, oh, it's just a kid or two. It's these couple of kids that get referred over and over again. So within the context of your analysis, you can control and identify whether it's how many unique referrals exist. So you can look at the pattern overall, but then you can look at the pattern to say, what is the number of unique students that were referred, and does the pattern exist at that level? And what I'll tell you is likely to happen is it's going to exist whether it's your global data without disaggregating it for uniqueness, and when you control for unique number of referrals. So basically what I mean by that is, so we had students that were referred multiple times, and when we controlled for that variable, we said, oh no, we're only going to count you one time per type of referral. The pattern still exists, not per referral. You were only counted once, whether you were referred one time or 50 times. When you controlled for that as well, the patterns of the referrals and the disproportionality continued. So if you look at, if you wouldn't mind going to the next slide, Nicole. So we basically were able to take that data and view it similarly to what we did with this. Hold on.
The joys of school psychology.
I know. I didn't choose wisely in terms of my office location for this, apparently. So we're looking at your baseline race and ethnicity data here. So it really is giving you a sense of what are the number of students that were referred for, and not referred. This is just how many students exist in this given building. So I just looked at that, and it gives you the percentage makeup there. So you want to know that going in. So you can see all the different categories here. Now, I want to point out something regarding the Hispanic Latino data there. That's one of the things that when you look at the federal codes, it becomes tricky because of the way it's coded. So you can miss students that are Latino because they tend to get coded in ethnicity columns versus race columns. And not tended, they are coded in ethnicity versus race columns. So you need to know that and be able to account for how that makes sense for you and how you want to capture that information. The way the baseline rule that we use is that if you were in the ethnicity column as being identified as being Hispanic Latino, then we counted that as being the primary group. And that's just the way we organize the data that way. And so I bring that up because it becomes a coding concern. And I'll be honest, the way we noticed that this was a problem is when we ran the data and that row came up with 0, that seemed odd to us. So then we looked back and went, oh, right, we didn't account for that. So that's the solution that we use to account for that. In case you all want to know, the 2nd and 4th grade busters have now been dismissed. So there you go. Thank goodness. So then what we do after that, so you get all that, so you have to know your baseline, which is what is the actual representation in your population. And then we're able to calculate risk ratios, which is similar to what I described globally when you looked at the special ed data, which is you're actually calculating the ratio of the representation in the discipline referral data relative to the representation in the actual population. So obviously you're ideally looking for a ratio that is 1, because that means that you're being very equitable in your practices and everybody's going to refer at the same rate as they actually are represented. So here you can see this chart, and I basically took all that information from that Excel graph and put it into this table to make it more digestible, which is looking at the percentage makeup and this was based on our middle school, and then total referrals by race and ethnicity status, and the percentage makeup by race and ethnicity status for that, and then the actual risk referral. What is the ratio relative to the percentage in the population? So what you can take away from that is that, and I'm hovering my cursor over the 4.36, which you can't see that I'm doing that, but that's the one I'm hovering over. That should tell you right there, that's not 1, is it? It is not. So we're referring students who are Hispanic Latino at a significantly higher rate than they're represented in the population. Same for Black and African American. What do you notice about whites?
At this time,
We're done. Everybody's gone or going. We actually refer at a lesser rate than the represented population. 0.95 is the ratio. Asian students, I will point out a potential glitch you have to be aware with the Asian students, because it's such a small portion of the population. You have to be mindful of that as you're looking at it, but still that's a pretty significant rate. And same with Native American and others. So when you're looking at that, excuse me, Native Hawaiian and others, you can see that tells you whether your patterns exist. And that's a conversation to have, which is why. So when Nicole was talking about sharing this data with staff and how do you have these conversations, what I'll share with you is that my initial approach, I will say, was probably perhaps a touch flawed in terms of how I did it, which was I shared this information with our staff at a faculty meeting and basically said, we refer students at a significantly higher rate who are either Latino or Black than we do white kids. And there were a lot of bright red faces in the room when I shared that, a lot of questions of, well, that's not true, it can't be accurate, or it's because we have a couple of kids and they get referred all the time. And then I shared the slide where I controlled for that when we did that. And that's a couple of slides further. So I want you to remember these numbers, this 4.36, the 3.39, the 0.95. And as we scroll a little bit further, we'll go two little further. because I'll just jump to that for the purpose of this conversation. What I'd like you to see is that, yeah, the pattern was slightly less significant, but it still exists. The pattern still exists, still at a much higher rate than they represent in the population. And look what happened to the white population, even fewer. So the conversation was, we had a lot of conversations about that and saying, well, what does that mean? Does that mean that we should stop referring kids who are Black or kids who are Latino for discipline or office discipline referrals? No. What it means is you need to do it in an equitable manner. So if you have two kids in front of you and they've done the exact same thing, they both need to go to the office if it's inappropriate. You don't get to pick based on melanin who goes to the office or who doesn't. You don't say, well, this child, he's Black, and clearly his behavior was much more problematic than that. Why? Why is that? If they engage in the same inappropriate behavior, they should both be going to the office at the same rates. That's the point of, that's equitable. And that's what conversation we have to continue to have, is that we want to make sure that people understand that, and this helps you to get a handle on what the scope and nature of the problem is for you. For us, you can see that it's students who are Hispanic, Latino, or Black. Those are the populations that tend to be referred at a significantly higher rate. So that's a concern. We need to be having conversations. We need to be talking to people about vulnerable decision points. We need to be thinking about what our culture looks like. We need to be thinking about those questions as we're going through this and not denying that. So, I'm sorry, I was just reading a question real quick in the chat. I probably shouldn't do that. So what I want to do is you need to get a handle on the scope and nature of your problem. And I can imagine if you're a district and we don't have a zero tolerance policies, but I can imagine if you're in a district that has zero tolerance policies, you would see these rates being even more dramatic. And that's something you need to be thinking about, is what does your policy, what does your program look like? What does it look like in terms of how you discipline kids? How are teachers trained in terms of what is discipline versus not? What is office discipline worthy? What if you're using PBIS, as Nicole mentioned earlier, what are your majors and minors? What does that look like as you're moving forward, and how you're approaching students and how you're engaging students and addressing those concerns as they come up, and training staff to do that. That's a big issue. So your data tells you the tale about what's going on. And what I would do in sharing this data, and what I did, and Nicole has it highlighted there as well, is that it's not, I wouldn't just show the numbers. I would show the numbers, but then I would put it in a context. So that way you have an understanding, and people can have an understanding of what it means when you're looking at these numbers, what that data means as you're pulling that down. And this is something that school psychologists were ideally trained to do. I will tell you that I would say there's probably nobody else in the district who's capable of doing this type of analysis the way you are trained to do. It's a matter of having the will to do that, and being willing to pull down that information and really try to get access to that and show what the patterns are. ProPublica does it for you to a degree. It's slightly less sensitive because it's truly based on publicly reported data that has to go to the state and federal levels. So it might not be as real time and resonant, because this is analysis that we do on a monthly basis based on office discipline referrals. So that way we can have an ongoing conversation about what the trends are looking like. And and it gives you the opportunity to have those conversations about the vulnerable decision points and how are you managing your students? Are you focused, as Nicole pointed out, are you focused on teaching? Or are you focused on punishing? And really, are you making a difference in terms of how you decide those processes? And to one of the questions that came up, I saw briefly, was about discipline and changes. And actually, one of the things we did as a result of doing this analysis is we completely changed at our middle school how we handle suspensions. Totally changed it. We looked at all the data, recognized that we had these patterns, and said, what's going on here? This system isn't working. And frankly, and I'm sure this conversation might be true for a number of your schools, is that in-school suspension or out-of-school suspension really don't result in a significant behavior change among the students that you're doing. Maybe you have those one kid who did something boneheaded once, and they're horrified by the fact they was going to be suspended, and they changed their behavior, but that was that kid is the exception and the one who likely was not going to be a problem anyway. But you have a lot of students that frequently are coming up as high rates of discipline referrals to the office, and then high rates following by in school or out of school suspension. So what we did is we took all of this data, and then we took all of the behavior data, and we analyzed who the students were who were consistently most at risk, and we targeted them for groups. And the groups were, we just want to figure out what's going on. So we pulled them into groups with we have a social emotional learning coach at the middle school with our school counselors and with our psych interns. And we ran groups just to say, what's going on? Let's talk about how you're engaging with school, and really just tried to focus on, as it turned out, the biggest issue we had was a sense of belonging, as the students weren't feeling like they were a part of school. And then we changed how we did in-school suspension, and frankly talked to the administrators about really not doing out-of-school suspension unless it was a weapons violation of some kind. But the in-school suspension was changed to be instructive. Instead of going into a dank room and staring at a wall and just doing academics all day, we made it instructional. What are you doing? How are you going to make amends for what you did? Why did you end up here? Let's process through what that was. Let's figure out what you can do differently to go back into class tomorrow. Is this a pattern? Is this a problem that goes on daily, or is this a one-off kind of thing? And really work through that in those groups to develop skills among those students to A, help them not end up being referred again, but also B, really find out what's going on with them and really change the nature of this to say, if you're getting referred for in-school suspension, then there's probably there's a problem there that's bigger that we need to be addressing. So we totally changed how we approach discipline in that regard, because we wanted to be instructive and supportive of students. How do we move the needle to address these patterns? Because the patterns exist. And, and if you looked at the groups that we were running, yeah, they were somewhat disproportionate as well, because we were using the existing data to determine who was at risk. But what we found is when we started working with the students, they started to feel engaged and connected to people. They felt like school was their place because they had people who cared about them, people who were engaging with them. If you think back to your maybe recall research on resiliency about what the single biggest protective factor for a student is, for a child is, it's an adult who cares about them. An adult. So that could be a parent, could be a teacher, could be a coach. In this situation, we had multiple adults that were sharing and demonstrating day in, day out to students that they cared about them. It totally changed the dynamic. And we coupled that with coaching up the teachers. So it wasn't simply working on this saying, this is a student problem. This is also a staff problem. So we wanted to address the concerns because we knew the students were feeling disenfranchised, but we also had to address the other side of that ledger, if you will, the balance there, which is how do we help the staff to develop the skills to be able to manage their classes more appropriately and to have more appropriate responses that actually would result in positive change. If somebody's doing something you don't like in your class, well, how do you manage that as opposed to losing it and having issues with them? And usually it was certain populations of students that you would not be giving the benefit of the doubt to. So we want to make sure that we were helping them and coaching them on that and having those conversations on a consistent basis. So if we can go to the next slide, Nicole, if you wouldn't mind. Did I show this one already? I don't know if I did or not. No, I don't think I did. This is when we actually controlled for unique referrals, for the multiple referrals. We really got down there. So again, this is another way in which we really pulled down and got to the point of saying the patterns continue to exist. It really gives you an opportunity to reflect on your data and really look at that and recognize where the patterns are. So, and I have an Excel spreadsheet that's designed to do this. I'm happy to share it with you. It might not be you. You might have to change some of the columns and things like that, but at least is a leaping off point to do that if you're not sure, or if you're not sure how to do this analysis. I realize there are 130 some people on this call, but if you reach out to me, I'm actually happy to talk you through it and walk you through it, and maybe we can Zoom and go through that process. Because it's if you're not savvy in Excel, it might be a little tricky right out of the gate, but it's something that is really valuable to do. I will say, and this is a plug for our patent friends, is that there are certain states that actually have portals where people can enter their data in and it will calculate all this for them, like Wisconsin. I think Wisconsin used to have those very publicly obvious. I don't know if they still do or not, but they had that. But it might be something to consider. So that way it develops a tool for that folks can do that on their own as well. So that's just a little plug there for that. Totally just popped into my head. So sorry for putting you on the spot. All right, next slide is really getting at some of that course inequity that we talked about in terms of access and opportunities. And really, and I know I touched on it a bit earlier, and this is straying slightly from discipline, but they're somewhat related, is, you know, when we start to have kids that are struggling right out of the gate because of their ability to do school the way we have it structured in their experience of school, then it factors into this. Because I can guarantee you, without a doubt, that the students that were represented in the disproportionate data prior that I showed you are not represented in these math classes, not represented in the AP classes, not represented in the honors classes, not necessarily getting internships. They're not being represented there. So it's not simply an academic issue. The behavioral part and the discipline part absolutely 100% factors into that and creates these issues for you. And again, the last thing there is where did this issue begin? I can guarantee you the issue doesn't begin in the upper grades. That's where you see it. It's my diseased tree analogy, is that it shows up because the roots started as early as kindergarten. How did the kids experience school for the first time? Do their teachers like them? Are they engaged? Are they being supported? Are they making progress? That's a huge issue. And I put in there, I think, about the Future Ready Index. I confess, it's a great way to look at it because it gives you some information on, you know, the percentage of population for economically disadvantaged and participation in AP courses and things of that nature. I'm actually, there's some data I wish they would add to this that I feel has been lost. The previous iteration, the school performance profile had some data that I thought was very helpful in terms of having these conversations about discipline and the groups that are disproportionately affected. But I think that there's definitely value in looking at that as well, because you can see what the rates are. So if we can advance the next two slides, I just showed you our Ready Index, I think is the next one. So, and we can jump to the next one, Nicole, if that'd be, thank you. So now you've identified your problem. Now you've analyzed your problem. So now what are you gonna do about it? So that's the next slide, which is you definitely need to figure out who your target audiences are for this. Who are you going to talk to first? Because I'll be honest with you, when we first started having this conversation about 7 years ago, I can remember at that point we had just run our special ed referral data, and I set up the meeting and we went into a conference room, and I swear to God, you'd think we were sharing the nuclear launch codes, because people walked in and they were like, okay, we're going to talk about race and ethnicity in our special ed referral data. And we're to speak in hushed tones because it is the problem that shall not be named. And really that's what it boiled down to, is that people are uncomfortable with it and scared of it, even administrators. So what they tend to do is they don't want to talk about it because they don't want to be perceived as being racist. I'm just going to say it. That's the big issue. People don't want to be called racist. And it's like, well, you know, I won't make the comment I made once before because this is being recorded, but I will refrain. I'll show some restraint. I will say the shoe fits, if the shoe fits. But anyway, it's not about being racist. The bias exists. We know that. It's really about being able to confront that and how do you address it in a proactive and productive manner. And to deny it and pretend like it doesn't exist is not helpful. The problem will just persist. So we need to organize, and we need to be able to have open conversations, which was what we've been talking about all morning about how to do this. Who are the stakeholders that need to be aware of this? What staff need to be aware? So it might be that you share this, you run this data analysis and you figure out, yeah, we're disproportionate and this is how we're disproportionate. Your first line might be, all right, Principal X, we need to have this conversation. Let's talk about how we want to move forward to address this. And then you move forward. And then you say, all right, let's talk to central office administration. I want to do this. Your first step is probably not like taking out an ad in the local newspaper. your first step is really addressing the people who are in this, the stakeholders that have this. There are lots of NASP resources. I put in the chat earlier from social justice, how to get that. And you do need to recognize that, yes, this will not be an easy topic to have this conversation about. It's not going to be easy. But the staff do need to be aware. You need to be bringing them into this conversation. You can't pretend like this is just an administrative conversation. We all need to be having this conversation. And there's lots of information here that in this, and then what you heard this morning that should help with having these conversations. It will not, yes, it will not be easy to discuss. So in there, and I know we're running short on time. Oh my gosh, we're really running short on time. So there are the NASP resources. I'm going to shut up and let Nicole jump in, because the next slide, if you're not aware, and I know we've lost a couple of people, that we're going to jump to, let's just go ahead to the Equity Hub, because we only have like 4 minutes left.
Okay, no problem. But just so you know, you can reach out to either one of us at any time. Jason, there's a lot of interest in the Excel spreadsheet that you indicated, so I'm sure you'll be getting some emails after today. But just really quickly, I wanted to show you the Equitable Practices Hub so that you can continue to kind of professionally develop yourselves in ways that can support your efforts. So let me go ahead and take you to the Padlet, because that's probably a nice way to bring this together. You will see the Equitable Practices Hub here. When you click there, the screen will pop up with the splash page for the Equitable Practices Hub, and this is produced by PDE. And I'm really excited that I've had an opportunity to have a hand in it. So, a school psychologist has touched this. So we're definitely excited that you would take some time to go through it. When you go there, though, and again, if you want more information on this, you can certainly reach out to me. But what I want to show you very quickly is that there is a disciplinary equity pillar of practice. We call them equity pillars of practice. When you click there, very quickly, you'll get a description of what disciplinary equity is, which is why you were here today. And you can actually find resources that are dedicated to specific roles. So whether it's individual professional learning or resources that you need, whether from a classroom lens, you want to give some resources to teachers, or from a district school systems level change, right? We can click there. And as we close out, hopefully it opens for me, you will see that the topics for this are arranged in using engaging instruction, implementing a behavior framework, disaggregating data, which we've talked about, developing policies for accountability, and then neutralizing implicit bias. So remember, neutralizing routines, vulnerable decision points, and then there are specific resources under each one of those topics that can help you engage and support your efforts system-wide. So with that being said, I'm going to stop share and see if there are any questions, and thank Jason for being an awesome partner in this effort, my co-conspirator. I just adore him. I'm happy we had this opportunity today. Jason, any final words before Dr. Karuder takes us out?
Just honestly, I was thinking about it as you were talking, Nicole, and if you're trying to decide on if you think, hey, I want to do some staff development right out of the gate that would be helpful to address this problem, I would say to train them on vulnerable decision points, because that is probably the lowest hanging fruit you can get that will say, look, if you can just get people to be thoughtful about how they're doing discipline, period, it will go a long way to help with equity, and it'll grease the wheels for things you need to do further. So that, I would say, that might be a great place to start. And thank you, Nicole. I love always presenting.